Okay, can I welcome members, officers and members of the public to today's meeting of the London Assembly Transport Committee. The main item for discussion today will be road user charging. Can everyone in the room make sure your electronic devices are switched off or on silent mode? And can I start by asking our clerk, Diane Richards, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received today from Assembly Member Barrett. And in accordance with Standing Order 2.4, Assembly Member Bailey will be confirming he will attend virtually.
Thank you very much. Item 2 is our declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No, thank you very much. Can we, at item 3, confirm the minutes of the Transport Committee meeting held on the 15th of November 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. And then can we also note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee? Great. And then at item 5, can we note the action taken by me as chair under delegated authority, which was to endorse the appointment to the London Travel Watch Director position as agreed by the recruitment panel, and to agree the further response to the consultation on the revision to the Mayor's transport strategy in a letter to the Mayor of London? And can we also note the appointment of Michael Roberts as the London Travel Watch Chief Executive Officer?
Agreed.
Thank you. So, yeah, we now move to our main item of business. I think it's really good that we're following up previous Assembly work, which really did lead the way on having a proper discussion about the future of road user charging and the potential to do it in a smarter way. This meeting isn't intended to come to a conclusion about whether or not this should go ahead. We're here to give some real proper interrogation and scrutiny to the question of if this were to go ahead, what the implications would be, and to dig into it quite a lot. So I'm really looking forward to an interesting discussion today. I'd like to welcome all our guests for this item. So starting with Adam Tyndall, who is the Programme Director for Transport at Business London, which, if I can say, was London first until quite recently, just so everyone's clear. Then we have Nick Bowes, who is the Chief Executive for the Centre for London in the room. And joining us virtually, we also have Matthew Hudson, who is a director for Rebel Group. We have Sarah King, who is the development manager for the Federation of Small Businesses. And we have Silviya Barrett, who is the director of policy research and projects for Campaign for Better Transport. We're also expecting, transport permitting, Carolyn Axtell, from who is the Car Free London campaigner for the organisation Possible, to join us shortly. So let's kick off with a question, I think, first of all, to Nick Bowes and then to Silviya Barrett. Is it easier now, Nick, to talk politically about smarter pay-as-you-drive road charging as a potential policy? And if so, what's driven this change?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for inviting me today. I think it probably is, because I think Londoners now are increasingly having to pay other forms of charges to drive, such as the congestion charge, but also the ULEZ with the expansion of ULEZ. So I think Londoners are probably getting a little bit more accustomed to having to pay in one way or another. But I think they're probably also appreciating that it's a really quite clunky charge, and it's a binary charge. You pay it regardless of how far you drive or where you drive, really, and it feels probably to quite a lot of Londoners that maybe don't drive very much as not massively fair or reflective of usage. So I think perhaps Londoners are thinking, maybe there's a better way of doing this, and it may well be that that's paying for how far you drive rather than just a flat charge, regardless of where or how often.
And do you think it's been difficult to talk about it in the past for political reasons?
I think anything to do with charging people to use their cars is politically difficult and always will be, whether that's introducing control parking zones in local areas. Where I live in Lewisham, there's a consultation going on at the moment about the introduction of a CPZ, which I can see on the local Facebook group is generating a lot of interest, all the way up to how much fuel duty there is. So I think it always has been, it is, and I'm sure it will continue to be very politically difficult, and probably even more so at the moment because of the cost of living pressures and the squeeze that many people are feeling.
Thank you very much. So over to Silviya. The question there was, is it easier now to talk politically about it? I know you've done some opinion research as well that might lead to some points you might want to make. If you want to just run through that for us, that would be great.
Yes, thank you. I think, first of all, on the political point, I feel that it is easier for the Mayor of London to talk about progressing road user charging now because of the progress that he has made with the ULEZ expansion, first to the to inner London and consequently to outer London as well. So as well as the research that's done on what is actually needed to reach net zero by 2030, which is the commitment that the mayor has made, there is clear calculation that we need to reduce traffic by 27% at least to reach that commitment. And the only way to achieve that is through charging people, as well as provision of better alternatives and improving public transport further. So I think politically that sort of necessity has become much clearer. And secondly, on the public acceptance, as you said, we have done some polling on national pay-as-you-drive for road pricing for vehicle taxation purposes, as well as local charging schemes, such as the ULEZ or road user charging in London. I've done some analysis of the London Cut, and Londoners are the region and the group that is most supportive of both national and local charging. And that is because Londoners really understand the need to reduce congestion and air pollution. So at the start, when we asked about people's top concerns about transport, congestion was the #1 concern, followed by air pollution. So people are much more aware of the implications and the difficulties that those things present to their daily lives and to their family's health. National pay-as-you-drive is something that that Londoners and the general public support to a great extent because it replaces, it would be something to replace potentially fuel duty and VD. But in London, we have the advantage that a pay-as-you-drive system would replace existing charges, so it would not be additional on top of additional charges, but you take something away and obviously replace it with something fairer and better, and that's the advantage of that.
Thank you very much. From that national perspective, do you think now that the reduction in vehicle and fuel duty tax revenue that's going on makes something like this inevitable at a national level?
Yes, absolutely. We know that petrol and diesel vehicles will start to be phased out from 2030, and with that, revenue from fuel duty and VD will decline. The government has now introduced VD charges for electric vehicles from 2025, but fuel duty is the big chunk of revenue. It contributes to around 28 billion every year, and that pays for public services, so it goes towards general taxation, as well as maintenance of roads and other public goods. So it's a big chunk of money that the government will need to replace. Of course, it's very tempting for current governments to say, well, that will be a problem for the next government and leave it to the next government to deal with. But what we're trying to tell politicians now is that actually the public are much more supportive of this than you think. So we've got an overall support for pay-as-you-drive nationally at 49% of the general public. And that's much higher than what previously was thought. And we're hoping that all political parties would coalesce around the need to reform vehicle taxation and look into that after the next general election.
Okay, thank you very much. We often talk about VED in the Assembly, and I think we have an estimate that around upwards of £500 million is paid out by Londoners in vehicle excise duty. Do you have any idea of how much of that 28 billion in fuel duty Londoners contribute?
I don't have the numbers for that, but I can try and find out afterwards.
That would be excellent if we could find that out. It'd be useful to know what we're all currently paying out. Back to Nick briefly. Specifically in London, do you think the development of a new scheme is necessary or primarily motivated by the need to raise more funding for London's public transport services and fill that gap in our revenue? Oh, can you?
Yeah, obviously there is a shortfall in TfL's budget, and there's pressures around there. So the idea of trying to generate income from other sources is obviously high up the agenda at the moment, and this is one of the ways that could well happen. I think the thing about a pay-per-mile road user charging scheme is that it could deliver on a lot of objectives as well as generating income, whereas the congestion charge and ULEZ are very much focused on achieving one specific objective. Done properly, the pay-per-mile scheme could deliver on all of those objectives, tackling congestion, improving air quality, promoting active travel, as well as generating income. I think the real question is how do we make sure that all of the money that is generated goes into improving public transport in the areas that need it the most, which at the moment is particularly outer London. And it's a bit chicken and egg. How do you improve the public transport in advance of bringing in a scheme like this when there isn't a lot of money around? But you really probably would need to do so if you were to bring the public with you.
At the government level, we talked about the fuel duty and VED dropping. Apart from the pandemic blip, historically we've not had a reduction in income from fares. We would be expecting congestion charge and ULEZ income to drop, though. So is that also something that motivates at a London level?
Well, the objective of the ULEZ was always for income to drop. That was obviously the objective, and that the idea was that more people would drive compliant vehicles. So that always was the case. But that income, as long as it does contribute money, is obviously really critical for TfL at the moment. I think that if you are going to do something, particularly if it's a London-wide scheme, you are going to generate substantial amounts of income, which could well be a huge component of what TfL invests in public transport. I think Londoners will need to see the link between what they are paying and what happens with that money in terms of public transport. I think what they don't probably want to see is it just disappearing into existing budgets and there being no improvement in the transport system.
Okay, that's really helpful. I'll pass over to Assembly Member Baker now for some follow-up on that.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I've got a couple of follow-ups on those subjects. Welcome, guests. Nick, firstly, I think it was helpful and interesting that you sort of started off basically saying all charging for driving is sort of politically difficult. I wonder whether you have any thoughts of why that is and whether it's inevitable.
Gosh, that's a really difficult question because it's such a complicated debate and it's very heated. And my personal experience, I don't own a car, so just to put that out there. But I understand the pressures on those that do, and it's expensive, and particularly so at the moment. I think we did some polling actually back in the spring where we asked Londoners. Well, I'll read the question. I can share the full data with the committee. But we asked Londoners. Some people think that we should replace road tax, congestion charge on ULEZ, with pay-per-mile road user charging. How much people paid would depend on how far they drove and how polluting their vehicle was. How far would you support or oppose this change? Well, actually, more Londoners supported it than opposed it, and actually car-owning households were more in favour of it than non-car-owning households. And there was no difference, significant difference between Labour voters and Conservative voters. So it was quite interesting, and we've got a full set of data tables for this, where we've got cross-tabs on every different way of cutting the population. But I thought that was really quite an interesting stat, and I guess it kind of makes sense because if you don't own a car, it's kind of whether you pay £15 a day or £1.50 to drive 5 miles instead, it doesn't massively affect you financially. but I'm happy to share that data with the committee. I think it might be quite interesting and useful.
Yeah, that is helpful, and that is really interesting. And I think that that debate seems to be around all car charges is very, very polarising. And I suppose I live in hope that there is a way of getting it to a better place, although we may not be able to see it at the moment. So to Silviya, which screen am I looking at? Sorry, I'll just speak into the void. Sorry, Silviya. Similar to this question, and we've sort of talked about. And I think the stats that Nick was talking about is basically people would prefer one to the other, and they feel maybe that pay per mile or road pricing is fairer than a flat tax. But I think your response to the last year's Commons Transport Committee investigation said it's absolutely crucial for public acceptance that the move to road pricing is seen as fair. How much scope does that give us to change the structure of it in a significant way to make it much fairer, and how difficult politically do you think that is now?
I think that there's absolutely enormous scope to make the scheme much fairer with a smarter system, and that's because if you charge by distance, you're not penalizing people that are making shorter journeys, and in lots of people's eyes it's not fair to pay a set daily amount for making a journey that is much shorter than someone else that is driving a much longer distance. So that's the first sort of premise of fairness. Then you have the option to vary the charge by vehicle emissions and by the availability of alternatives as well. I think that is crucial because people feel that being charged for something when you don't have the availability of the alternatives is fundamentally unfair. We heard that in focus groups, we heard that in the polling that we did. And a smarter system would give you the opportunity to charge more in central London or inner London where there's very good public transport provision, and less in outer London or areas that have less dense public transport provision. And I think that's a crucial difference. And that is what people endorsed in the focus groups we did. Yeah. In addition to that, in London, when you're replacing that blunt charge with a fairer scheme, that is why people were much more supportive in London than they might be in other cities when they don't have anything similar that a smart system will take the place of. And I think that's the important difference here.
That's really helpful. And I know we're going to come back to those subjects later.
Thank you very much. Now, I must welcome our final guest for the morning, Carolyn Axtell, who is the Car Free London campaigner for Possible. Thank you for making it into City Hall today.
Apologies for being late.
It's absolutely understandable. And I think it's Assembly Member Baker needs to start a question to you next, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So the next question, we're going to direct this to Carolyn and then Silviya and Nick. And which strategies and targets could or should a new road user charging scheme support? For example, cutting traffic, climate emissions, air pollution, road danger. Which ones do you feel are most key for a road user charging?
I think all of them. Ultimately, it can help to fulfil objectives in all of those strategies. We know that now is the time. We know that you need to kind of seize the moment when, as Silviya was saying, public support has reached a certain level. We know that there's likely to be opposition, as with any sort of disruptive change, but that people will come on board when they start to see the benefits. So I think it's just a question of holding out and knowing that once the changes come, people will start to see that they actually want those changes, and I think there'll be a lot more support.
I'll come over to ask the same question to a second, but you're saying that you think people will only come on board after it's imposed, because I would really like us to work towards people understanding and getting changes that they can see will benefit them before.
Yeah, understood. I think if the messaging is really clear around why this is needed, why it's important, because I think that's what people struggle with perhaps at the moment, is not really understanding the need for traffic reduction, the urgency of reaching the net zero 2030 goals in London. So I think if all the messaging is really clear around how the issues around fairness are being addressed, then I think that will make a difference. But ultimately we know that any change, any sort of disruptive change, people often do struggle with, because they can't see how things are going to be different. But you know, a lot of our research, we've gathered like 25 different stories in our interactive map of, you know, car-free stories of different cities, and there's some fantastic examples there where, despite whatever has been happening politically, people have ultimately embraced the changes. If you look at somewhere like Madrid, where the left of centre city administration, you know, brought in these kind of changes, and then later on there was a new administration voted in, and it was in their manifesto to actually backtrack on all of that. There were huge protests, you know, and in the end they kept it in because people wanted to keep the changes.
I think we're going to come back to some international comparisons. Yeah. Okay. So you feel that these changes would have to be disruptive then? So the introduction of road user charging, there's no way of making that suit people's needs, the needs of people in London.
I think if it can be done without any level of disruption, then that would be fantastic. It's more just that people tend to find change difficult, and obviously the messaging around it is really important to overcome that. But at the same time, it could simplify things. You know, as Silviya was saying, at the moment, you know, you've got the congestion charge, you've got the ULEZ. If we can replace it with something which is simpler, then that could also help to, you know, people to see it in a more positive light.
Thank you. So Silviya, the same question: which strategies or targets do you feel could or should a new road user charging scheme support?
It's a difficult question. I think that the mayor has got it right. I mean, in terms of, it needs to be clear that it's not for revenue raising purposes, even though obviously the need is there in terms of Transport for London's budget. But legally, obviously, such a scheme needs to only be proportionate to addressing congestion and pollution in London. And these are problems that Londoners understand. As I said earlier, so 41% I think of Londoners said they were concerned about congestion, 39% are concerned about air pollution, and these are quite significant numbers. More and more people are aware of those issues. So I think focusing the messaging around why this is needed, alongside obviously climate change, more people are aware of the impacts of that, particularly with the extreme weather events that we have had over the summer and at other times. So I think just communicating that impact, that we can't just drive cleaner vehicles, we also need to collectively drive less where that is possible. And alongside the messaging and measures of improving public transport in areas that don't currently have it, I think that is a fundamental factor for getting people's support in this issue. I haven't got the numbers to hand, but there was a significant proportion of people that said they would be more supportive of changes if there was this implementation of better public transport.
Thanks, Silviya. And Nick?
So I agree with both previous speakers. I think the technology offers the potential to deliver on all of the objectives and as many objectives as you want, because it really offers the objective to deliver on tackling congestion, improving air quality, promoting active travel, and generating income and reducing accidents as well on the roads. I think that, though, comes with a problem, because I think that makes it a lot harder to communicate to Londoners about what the benefits are. I think the real benefits of the congestion charge and ULEZ were that it basically did what it said on the tin. And I know that when the congestion charge was brought in, Redmond O'Neill, who some of you will know, who worked very closely with Ken Livingstone, was absolutely insistent that it would be called a congestion charge because it made it really clear what it was aiming to do. I think it's harder with a paper mile road user scheme. You can't capture multiple objectives in a really simple name. And I think just coming back on another point too, I think I mentioned this before. I think if you really want to try and minimise a kind of disruption, you've got to obviously give a really long lead-in time, and I think you've got to front up the improvements of public transport in advance. But that's very costly. And going back into the mists of time, when the congestion charge came in, Ken Livingstone borrowed against the future incomes from the congestion charge and improved the buses in central London in advance. And that was a really important move. I think in the current financial climate, that is probably a bit trickier to do, particularly on the scale that you would probably need to do it, because Ken did it just in central London. But I think that it's absolutely critical to try and do as much as that as possible. Otherwise, you're maximising disruption rather than minimising.
Thanks, that's really helpful. I have fond memories of that improvement buses. It cut my journey to work significantly. I wonder, we were panel wondering whether Matthew would like to come in on that question, which is about the strategies and targets that a new road user charging scheme could support.
Yeah, thanks. I hope you can hear me. I think Nick put his finger on it, which is about being clear about what the objectives are. And I would very much worry about having too many objectives. It becomes a difficult thing to message. And one of the things I've got noted here is just to think through when I think about the launching, so I think of the more practical aspects of how you would launch such a scheme, whether you would want to launch it at certain target groups to begin with, at smaller areas, and build it up, so you could have a longer narrative to build up a congestion charge over a road user charging over time, without necessarily launching everything everywhere at one go. So I would sort of put that to the panel to think about how things could prioritise, which I think is possible given some of the costs of the scheme could be a lot lower now, but I'm sure we'll come on to that sort of aspect later.
Thanks everyone. Back to the chair.
Thank you very much. And so to bring in the rest of our guests and ask further questions, I have Assemblymember Rogers.
Thank you very much, Chair. Some questions on the business view of road user charging. Maybe we'll start with Adam. What do London's businesses think about the potential for road user charging?
Thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I think the key thing for London's businesses is the congestion that they face in the city, and that's a real cost on doing business. It's a real cost in terms of London's competitiveness, and the environmental aspects of that congestion are a real drag on London's attractiveness. And we know that London competes in a global marketplace for talent, for investment, and these are things that we hear in terms of what it's like to live here, work here, do business here. And we know that that's estimated to be about a £5 billion a year cost to the economy. Anyone that's ever driven or been driven around any part of London has sat in traffic for hours, and that's not fun. And it's not fun for businesses, it's not fun for people. So I think that has to be at the heart of any scheme. And I think the difference between congestion and environmental targets is that people feel congestion on a day-to-day basis. And I think we've done really well as a city in making air quality challenges tangible to people recently. We've seen the salience of climate issues rising as well. So there's a background noise here that can help on the environmental side. But in terms of giving people something for something, which is what happened with the congestion charge, businesses saw that they were paying a charge But in exchange, they were getting more reliable journey times. They were getting the ability to fit more jobs into their day. And that was a good deal. And so I think making sure that whatever we do, and this comes to the clarity and the communications point, whatever we do is giving people something for something in their daily lives. And I think there's a broader suite of stuff. You know, anyone that's driven around London has seen the state of the roads at the moment. You know, we've seen the story with Hammersmith Bridge. You know, we know that this is right. We know that things are not in a good way, and this could help that. And if we get that right, and people feel like they're paying and getting something in return, businesses feel like that. That's, I think, the way to build support.
Okay, so kind of harking back a little bit to the previous conversation, but you think the best way of winning businesses over to this would be quite a sort of a forthright message about congestion and how this will improve their bottom line. Is that what you? I
think that needs to be front and centre. Yeah. My suspicion is that needs to be front and centre for Londoners as a whole, but certainly for businesses, that needs to be front and centre.
And has your organisation done any sort of surveying or focus grouping of businesses on this specific topic?
So we don't have any recent quantitative data. We are looking to pull that together probably at some point next year. But qualitatively and in terms of our conversations, sort of focus group style discussions and anecdotally, congestion is always the thing that comes out top. Now, I think there's a real awareness and rising awareness, particularly amongst large businesses, that tackling the climate crisis is absolutely a priority. And I think that helps provide a broader acceptance for some of these changes. But in terms of day-to-day costs and doing business, congestion is the drag day-to-day.
Okay, thank you. Now, if I could bring in Sarah, because I know that the FSB has done some recent surveying of members on the Ultra Low Emission Zone expansion. And I wonder, what I don't recall is, was there any discussion on more general road user charging as part of that survey work? And if so, I just wonder what the outcomes were from that.
No, thank you very much. And again, yes, thank you for the invitation to come along to speak today. So just echoing the words that were previously mentioned, obviously in terms of businesses, businesses really do need to not feel the impact in any great way by any sort of future road scheme being introduced across the London region. But yes, in terms of the survey work that FSB has undertaken, we undertook in June this year a report and a survey to do with the ultra low emission expansion. But previous to that, in February 2021, we did a survey that helped us write a report on the infrastructure across London, which did include transport as one of the elements, along with things like broadband, for example. And in that particular report, 58% of businesses said to us that they were all for like a demand user road scheme system, but it had to be fair and one that didn't cost a huge amount in impacting their business. And this whole thing with congestion is really vital to sort of contend with the small businesses. They can't afford to have their daily business disrupted by congestion, which has already been discussed, but also the fact that any sort of new scheme isn't disrupting business going forward because they just don't have that time or ability to cope with that. But we have got some survey data available, as mentioned, from June 2022 and from February 2021.
So that's interesting because I know that the survey you did on the potential ultra-low emission zone expansion, there was a lot of concern amongst businesses about that. And do you think that was because they see it as disruptive and that's why they're worried about it and why they're concerned about it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the concern at the particular time taking that survey, it is the fact that there aren't the vehicles to replace the vehicles that they would like to use and upgrade across the capital and also the Greater London region, where there aren't the public transport facilities available like they are and reflect in the central area of London. And then in terms of the road scheme, it being a fairer system that's affordable, but a longer lead-in time to support them to make any adjustments.
Okay, thank you. And I guess a question perhaps for both of you, have touched on this, but what impact have the existing road charging schemes had on businesses? Maybe Adam, do you want to start on that one?
I think the congestion charge was largely seen as a success, and I think that sense of, as I said, getting something for something, and that this was a good deal, was really felt by London's businesses. I imagine Sarah will be better able to speak to small businesses and those in outer London who've been affected by various charges. But I think one of the things that businesses notice across the board is a sort of proliferation of different schemes here. So whereas as a sort of domestic driver, you might you might come across the congestion charge, you might come across the ULEZ. Businesses are affected by a raft of other things, including things like the London Lorry Control Scheme, which is an incredibly out-of-date piece of regulation based on what HGVs were like in the 1980s. So I think if we're going to do this, we should be thinking as holistically as possible about wrapping all of these schemes in, so that there is just one thing. There's one interface, there's one thing you need to deal with, and you know day by day what's going on, and you don't have to work your way through multiple, because don't forget we've got Silvertown Tunnel, river tolling crossing, river crossing tolls coming in as well. So this is getting ever more complicated, and of course the Treasury, as we've touched on, may come in and impose something on top of it all again. And and I think there's a real choice here for London, because whether London wants to move, act, and use this opportunity, because I think changes to the way that we pay for driving are inevitable now. And if London gets it right, we can get a load of extra benefits from this, and people can feel like it's a good deal. And we're making the city work better for everyone, for businesses, for Londoners. If we get it wrong, or if we're too slow, we can see a lot of the revenue that's generated in London just being extracted back up to Whitehall, and not seeing those benefits here in the capital.
So basically, what we're saying is that businesses, what they notice is this layer upon layer of various schemes with all the admin that comes along with them. Would that be a fair?
And this should be, if we pursue this route, this should be an opportunity to simplify and integrate those things into something that is an easier user experience for Londoners and businesses alike.
Thank you, Sarah. Do you have anything to add to that about what your members have seen from existing schemes?
It's definitely the lead-in time to any scheme, and the messaging has to be really, really clear. So long lead-in time, clear messaging, really for them to understand how it's going to impact their costs running a business in London, whether it's in or out of London. They just need to be fully informed and consulted upon well in advance to ensure that they can make the changes, they can afford the changes, and that it's clearly understood.
Thank you. Move on to my next question now, which is for Silviya initially. How advanced is national government thinking on this issue?
Well, it's safe to say that national government is not saying much on this issue at the moment, and it's very hard to judge what thinking has been done on this behind closed doors. But we have had conversations about our research with the Treasury, with the Department for Transport, with ministers and advisors. So the government is aware that support is increasing among the general public for reform, and that is not just because revenue from existing taxation is reducing and the need to replace that money so that we can continue funding public services, but because the current system is not very transparent and unfair in many ways too. So it's not, the problem is not coming just from electric vehicles and the increasing take-up, but also because people don't understand exactly how much they're paying with the current system, or because it's not fair that poorer drivers with more polluting vehicles might be paying more in VD per mile than people that have the income to buy more efficient newer vehicles. So there's many issues with the current system, as well as the transition to net zero, that we need to be addressing with this. The Transport Select Committee published a report on national road pricing in early this year. And the government has delayed responding to this because of obviously all the political turmoil that we had with elections and change of administration. But we know that the thinking is there. It's just a matter of ensuring that all political parties are on board with the need to reform, and that there isn't particular political parties that are opposing this, because we know that this will be a problem for the next government. So we need to put in place the agreement that we need to be looking into this at the national level as well as locally.
Thank you. Maybe if I come to Nick, because I know Centre for London have done some work on this, and during that work, what did you pick up about where government is and what the thinking was on this issue?
Actually, the work that we did, Silviya did, when she was previously working for Centre for London, but and I wasn't at Centre for London, but I am aware of the work. But I've also been party to one or two conversations over in the past on these types of conversations. Politically, I think that there's not probably much appetite nationally to go close to this at the moment. But I think officials know full well that this has got to happen, and they're absolutely desperate for London to go first. They're desperate for London to go first for two reasons. One, to just test public opinion. I think there's a view that London's probably the place where you can do this ahead of the rest of the country. It's shown that on other road user charging schemes. And two, they can iron out any problems, and then they can adopt it nationally. And I fully expect that they'd be urging TfL on behind the scenes to push ahead with this. I think that's a vote of confidence for London. That they think that London's the place where you really can try and make this work, and that they've got a track record of introducing road user charging schemes in one way or another, and therefore let's make the most of that. I think the slight risk is that, as we know with vehicle excise duty, it has been a lump of money that has, on the whole, been spent outside of the city, and in the past the Assembly have taken a strong view on where that money maybe should be allocated. And if London doesn't go first, and say the government does, I think as Adam was suggesting, the money may well be a lot of money may well be generated in London and siphoned off elsewhere, because we obviously know the current climate is not massively supportive towards investing a lot of central government money in London. And I think that would be a real risk for the city, and I think it would make it a lot harder to sell to Londoners and London's businesses if it looked like it was a charge for money that was going to be spent elsewhere.
Thank you. I think Silviya wants to come in on this point.
Yes, just to add one more thing. In terms of the cost of living crisis, many politicians and stakeholders are saying, well, it's not the right time, we shouldn't be thinking about this in the current situation. But our argument is that if designed right, a reform of the system has the potential to actually save drivers money, to save many drivers money. And what we saw in the survey is that many drivers are attracted to the proposition of being able to pay less if they drive less. And although some might say, well, fuel duty currently presents that sort of situation too, because it's not transparent, people don't associate necessarily how much they're paying in terms of how much they're driving. So having that transparency would actually encourage people to stay within a certain limit or to drive less. But also it's about how you vary the charge based on alternatives, based on, you could even vary it by people's income, so that you can be more targeted with what tax reductions you're giving to people, as opposed to with fuel duty, you either cut it for everyone or for no one. I think that idea of being more targeted and supporting some drivers with the cost of living crisis is the attraction in the current climate as well.
Actually, you've kind of touched on the next question, which is how would or should existing charges for owning and driving vehicles work alongside any kind of national scheme? So you're suggesting that you'd wrap up some of these into one charge?
It's yes, I think it's very important to be clear about the difference between a national scheme for vehicle taxation and local schemes for tackling congestion and pollution. But whether they remain separate or whether they are integrated will depend on the kind of system that is chosen. So if the government, central government, for example, would prefer to stay with a simple charge that only charges by distance and vehicle emissions and doesn't rely on tracking vehicle location to vary it by time of day and location, then it's a simple proposition where you just need to take the MOT distance reading of a vehicle on a regular basis, for example. Now that will not it will not account for the difference in location that a smart system would then add on top. So if you want to go to a smarter system where location is also tracked and you're varying the charge by availability of alternatives and by time of day, for example, then local schemes become redundant in that sense, because by definition that location will be reflected in the current charge. So if there is a potential to progress between these in stages, or you could start off with a smart system but provide people the option to opt out of tracking and just pay a lump sum. There's many sort of potential permutations. Okay. So yeah, whether a local scheme is integrated will depend on that.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll have more questions about implementation and technology later on. Assemblymember Bailey, who is also online, has indicated for a follow-up. Are you able to unmute? And...
Yes, can you hear me,
Great.
Chair?
Yeah, that's perfect. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. Good morning, panel. Just a quick question to Silviya, and maybe a few others want to chip in. Instead of seeking to plan a London-wide road charge using scheme, would it be easier or better for the mayor and mayors around the country to come together and approach the government with a plan to say how any nationally raised revenue could be distributed down to the regional level? Would that be a more efficient plan? Because one of the worries is that London would effectively Londoners would pay for the development of this new technology, this new scheme, then the rest of the country would benefit. And the question has to be, why should Londoners shoulder the cost?
I think you are right about that. So potentially it could be easier. It's about allocating the political burden of this as well. So I think ideally mayors and central government need to work on this together so that there is one direction of travel and that the public knows that this is for the benefit of everyone. In our submission to the consultation, we said that the mayor should be lobbying central government to use London as a pilot potentially for a national scheme. And in that way share the burden of the development, as you suggested. So that is an option. But yes, having that collaborative work on this would be important.
Do you think there's some work to be done where mayors around the country say, if we have a national scheme, here's how we feel the revenue should be allocated? Like we've had a conversation about vehicle, how that's distributed. I can't imagine the Chancellor is in the mood to give that money back to London. So is there a way that needs to be approached?
Yes, I absolutely agree. In our survey, people had very strong responses to the need for some of the revenue to be allocated locally and spent on local benefits and public transport improvements. In any scheme, especially if it includes local top-ups for congestion and pollution rather than being a flat scheme, there will need to be that revenue allocation agreement in advance of a scheme starting. So yes, I think that's very important. And I suppose the only reason why London is ahead and potentially has a better, what's the right word? A better sort of reason to be involved in this is because of the existing schemes and the benefit that it would provide to Londoners to replace that with a more fair and simple scheme.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Back to you.
Assemblymember Bailey, you can't see this because you're not in the room. In the room, Nick Bowes and Adam Tyndall have both indicated they'd like to reply to you.
Oh, I'd love to hear what they have to say. Thank
you.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think that the challenge you've got is that the mayors outside of London are even less likely to want to talk about this. I mean, most of them have struggled to bring in even the most basic of clean air zones, and have often kind of chickened out at the last minute. So and anybody who follows my Twitter feed knows how much I like to have a few spats with one or two mayors outside of London. I think the risk of going to central government and asking them to then divvy up the money and share it out is that you're basically just centralising even more decision making in the country. That's another bugbear of mine, in that actually the centre's not very good at running really big schemes, and then you put in control of those levers in the hands of officials and politicians, and you risk actually not getting anything or getting less than perhaps you think you should do. And I think it'd be much better to push down these types of decisions to local and regional levels. The point about whether it's right that Londoners should pay for the development of this technology, well, Londoners paid to develop the contactless pay-as-you-go, the first in the world, although a few people on Twitter yesterday were trying to argue that it wasn't when I made a point that it was. And it sold that technology around the world. So if London makes this work, because no other city's done this on this scale, it could actually be a revenue generator for the city, and may end up paying for itself in terms of the development of the technology. So I think there could be a positive to look at this, particularly if other cities in the UK and national government end up adopting the same scheme.
I see where you might be right, but also it's a big risk because this is much more complicated than Oyster, and Oyster was a direct benefit to Londoners. It's easy. It was easy to see the benefit directly for Londoners. But thank you for your contribution.
Assemblymember Bailey. Also, Adam Tyndall's going to come and answer your original question.
At the risk of repeating much of what Nick was clearly telepathically extracting from my brain, I think, look, any opportunity for mayors around the country to work together to make the case for city regions and greater devolution, is a good thing. We haven't had much success when it's come to roads. We've been talking about VED devolution for years without much success. So I think there's yes, let's keep going in terms of that national scheme, designing that so that it works for cities. But the answer is, why should London bear the cost? Well, because London will then get a scheme that suits London and that delivers benefits that are appropriate to London's unique dynamics. And then, as Nick says, no one complains about the fact that we developed the technology for the contactless payment system. I think sometimes you have to invest to reap rewards, and we absolutely need to be aware of that and the costs. But I think one of the things that we're going to come onto in terms of scheme design, I think, is actually we don't need to do this in the most complicated, expensive way. There are lots of different versions of this, and actually, I think I'm not necessarily signed up to the pay per mile language and scheme. I think there are a number of different ways, and there are ways that could leverage existing technology, potentially more cheaply, more quickly. But I understand we're going to talk about that a little later. So,
thank you, Chair. It'd be interesting to see how talk about would Londoners pay for a scheme inside London and then pay additional fees if they drove out of London. That would be interesting to me. Thank you, Chair.
Excellent, thank you very much. So passing over now to Assemblymember Pigeon for some questions.
Lovely, thank you. Just such an interesting discussion, actually part of any scheme, and we're going to come to technology later. I think I'm asking those questions is whether we own the intellectual property of what's developed, and we didn't originally with Oyster all those years ago and had to buy it. But actually look how successful that's been and probably generated income. We've really started touching on this, but it's still... what level is the right level to set this up? We've got Zebedee back again in the room. Should it be at a regional level? It makes sense to me, London, but actually, would it make more sense just to do this at a national level, given this was tried before under the Labour government, and just refreshing our mind in our briefing, I'd forgotten it even went to 10 pilot cities and areas, and the money was there, and then it got dropped. So, actually, what is the most logical level? Or is it just practically London has to lead on this? Nick?
Yes, I remember the Labour government. It was 2008, wasn't it? They decided to not go ahead with those. I think there's two elements of that. There's in an ideal world, what's the best level to kind of develop this, and then when that rubs up against reality,
yes.
I think maybe trying to do a national scheme that works for everywhere, that shares the money equally and fairly, would be where everybody would like to get to in a perfect world. But I think, as we've touched on already, London's the ingredients are there for London to go first and early because of the history that there is in London of developing road user charging scheme. Londoners are more used to it. The population's probably got more appetite for it, and central government is nervous about going first and wants someone else to do so. So I think it really will just be who's prepared to go first, and I suspect it'll be London. And at a national level, they'll just want to wait for someone else to test it and iron out the problems.
What if there's a change of government? There will be a general election at some point. We'll have an election. There could be a change of government. Do you see it being something that could be in a new government's plans? Or is no national government willing to touch this?
I've not seen any conversations at a national level about this at all, but I can't say I've been studying it in great detail. If I'm honest, I've not seen much talk about policies beyond the next general election from many of the political parties at the moment. I'm sure that will change over the next couple of years as we get a bit closer. I can't see it this being one of those things that people are going to want to put front and centre in a manifesto, if I'm honest.
No. It's just helpful to get your take on it. Adam, you wanted to come in.
The logic of this has never been the problem. Economists have been talking about this for decades.
Yes.
It's the politics, it's the pragmatism, it's how do we take steps forward rather than allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And the reality is London has better public transport than anywhere else in the country. And the reality is that Londoners are less reliant on their cars than anywhere else in the country. About half as many Londoners proportionally use their cars to commute as the next lowest region in the country. So, there are just underlying dynamics here as well that mean that it's probably more likely. And I think we should lose sight of that or wait for others to catch up.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. I want to move on to thinking about other cities, countries, internationally, how road user charging issues are being considered overseas. And I know in the Centre for London report you came up with quite an analysis. Who would like to kick off with that? Silviya, do you want to, from your research, talk about how other cities are looking at pay-as-you-drive, what's under consideration, what could we learn? I mean, I always think, your best ideas are ones you borrow and develop.
Yes, I'm just scrambling now to remember all the case studies in that report. But Singapore is obviously the city example of the most advanced smart road user charging at the city level. And that obviously works with in-vehicle devices. It varies
I missed where you said, Silviya. Where did you say?
Singapore.
Singapore, yes. Slightly different politics there, but yeah.
Exactly. Well, that is the classic example of a smart system. There are many cities that have congestion zone type charges that work on a sort of static daily charge. But not many are looking at the sort of smart version just yet, because it just needs the scale essentially for it to work on a distance-based level. On the national level, many countries are now thinking about the taxation revenue lost from electric vehicles. I think it's important not to conflate the two things. It's important to distinguish that the national system is for taxation and revenue-raising purposes to replace fuel duty potentially and other sort of excise duties lost to the transition to electric vehicles, whereas locally it's about addressing the impacts of car use, congestion, pollution, and road danger, and so on. But I think that the danger is that we conflate the two, and also national governments wait for cities to implement something locally, whereas local leaders would rather leave it to national government to implement a national scheme. And the danger is that neither of those things happen. We just keep passing the ball to each other. In addition to the thinking behind whether it should be national or local schemes, we did quite a few questions on that in our survey. And as I said, there was a strong preference that the money, at least part of it, should be spent locally. On the question if there's a choice between a national scheme or local schemes, there was a preference for a national scheme. But on the question if there was both of those things together, people preferred a national scheme with local top-ups as opposed to two separate systems, because two separate systems would just be administratively more complicated and harder to understand. So if we end up with a London scheme and there's eventually a national scheme, then potentially there's the option to bring those two together, but still be clear that one is for paying for your tax, basically, whereas the local top-ups are related to the city impacts of this. It's still important to distinguish between the two, I feel.
Lovely. So you're saying, but in terms of international examples, Singapore, Stockholm, which fully electronic, they've had huge behavioural change. You think those are the best examples for us to look at? What about places, I think you'd looked at places like Oregon, where they have a pay per mile, but that's instead of paying fuel tax.
Yes, exactly. So that is, again, not on a national level, but a state level, I think. So I guess the lesson is that you need to be clear why you're doing it, what are you replacing with it, what is the purpose. I mean, there are various sort of permutations between this, but we need to be clear about what we're trying to achieve and at what level. And if there's more than one system, how those two things integrate together.
They work together. Thank you. I'm going to bring Carolyn in next and then Matthew. Carolyn, have you got any thoughts? You touched on some earlier about international examples.
I don't think I've got anything to add to the examples that that Silviya's given.
That's okay, don't worry. Have a think, and if there's something else, indicate. No problem, no problem. Matthew, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think this is probably just backing up something that Nick said around not only does the country look to London, but a lot of the world looks to London as well. And when we look at some of the schemes out there, Singapore is the one because it's distance-based, Stockholm is a cordon, but many cities are starting to look at this. And one of the things we find as we speak to clients around the world, that again, all eyes are on London to see where London goes next. And I think that does sort of combine the experience it's had with delivering payments. So going back to the contactless story, which is well known and well done, I think London has that credibility to be able to deliver this, and a lot of the eyes of the world are looking to us as well. But those policies are certainly being discussed in many cities in terms of what is the strategic way to go forward to meet their, in effect, climate challenge goals that are applicable in every country.
Thank you. And the congestion that's costing cities all around the world. I mean, London's one of the most congested, but we know every other city you go to are absolutely clogged up. Anyone else want to come in on this question about international comparisons? No? Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Great, excellent. We are keen to know about that, so we'll probably be seeking some written responses from other people as well. So we're moving on to our second section of questions now, and I think we've really thoroughly done that whole question of London versus UK. So if we can frame the next section around, assuming London is developing a scheme for London, and get into the practicalities of that, that'd be really good. If we spent every question going, of course, if the national government did it, that would be more complicated. We'll spend a lot longer in this section. So starting off with questions, we have Assemblymember McCartney. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. And I think we've touched on quite a lot of what I'm going to ask anyway. But if London was to develop a smart system of pay-as-you-go road user charging, and I think if it's done properly, it could be fair across many different areas, whether it's congestion, air pollution, climate, and so forth. But how could this be implemented? I'm going to go to Silviya first. You've talked about distance travelled. You've talked about whether you've got alternative transport options in your local area, but what other factors could be taken into account?
Yes, I think as a minimum we should be looking at a distance charge, simply because it's a fairer way of reflecting use and actual impact of the journey than a set daily charge. In addition, if we are integrating the congestion charge with the ULEZ, we should be taxing by charging by vehicle emissions. And that's both to drive the uptake of cleaner vehicles and to reflect, obviously people's impact on air pollution and carbon emissions. The availability of alternatives, I think that's the sort of tricky question between, do you charge basically a set distance charge that doesn't require tracking, or do you integrate location, time, and with the requirement of tracking within that? But I feel that there's no other way to reflect the availability of alternatives and the fairness aspect to this, and that's a very important consideration for people when they consider fairness. Potentially, you could provide, free mileage allowance to people that live in postcodes with lower PTAL scores, for example. There might be ways to get around it. But I feel that if we're going for the smart alternative, then yes, the location tracking is something that we should be at least trialing and getting people's views on. When we surveyed about people's perception of technology, it was people were equally sort of supportive of tracking technologies as well as non-tracking ones. So I feel that the public perception is not necessarily a barrier to this.
Thank you. And Nick?
So the technology offers the potential to play a zillion tunes on this if you really wanted to, in that you could have a very sophisticated charge that varies how much you pay by where you drive, when you drive, how often you drive, what you drive, and there's many more on top of that, which on one hand is really fantastic if you really wanted to make it as fair as possible and to try and deliver on a number of different objectives. But the more complicated you make it, the harder it is to sell to Londoners and the harder it is to understand. For all that the congestion charge and ULEZ have got failings, people know in advance what the cost is. And I think that you would really want to try and have a scheme where you could tell vehicle users what the cost is going to be for the journey that they're going to make. So that I think that makes it harder to square that with playing a zillion tunes on it. I think that I was going to make a second point. I think that Londoners trust the contactless pay-as-you-go to charge them the right fare and to cap their fare daily. They built that trust really quite quickly. We all do it on a daily basis. We don't. Well, I certainly don't question it. Yeah. I kind of think it's going to charge me what it's going to charge me, and I know that they're going to charge me right. And I think that's quite an interesting study in how that happened and how people kind of got to that position. I think Assembly Member Hitchens is dead right in that people generally trust TfL and the brand to do that. Whether you'll be able to achieve something as quickly with a pay-per-mile road user charging scheme that road users know that they're going to be charged what the right cost is, I'm not sure. But I think looking at the contactless pay-as-you-go, there's at least a precedent there of where the brand really does help you get to the right place.
Okay, thank you. I've got Silviya wants to come back in, then I have Adam as well.
Just very quickly, I think if we're going for a smart charge, as we put in the green light report, it's important to not go for the fully dynamic option that they have in Singapore, which is basically where it's like in a taxi where you have the clock ticking and the rate charging depending on where you're driving, how much congestion is in real time on the road. Something more predictable, as Nick said, where you know the cost of each journey in advance, whether that's drawn up or whether it's something where you have zones similar to the card, so you know if you're going from zone 1 to 6, you'll be paying X. Something similar that's predictable is important for people.
Thank you. And Adam?
Thanks. I mean, I think what we're unpicking here is the range of options available. And so the question at this stage should perhaps be more what's the process for finding the right answer rather than what's the right answer, which is why I'm really hesitant to talk about pay per mile. I think there are a range of different ways of doing this. And I think it's important that Londoners, businesses, wider stakeholders are taken along on that journey. But that's going to be a long journey. And it's going to take time. And so we need to start it in earnest. And the research that Silviya's led on is a fantastic start in that regard. But we need a lot more data. We need to do a lot more to understand where Londoners are on this. And I think my suspicions are, I think, slightly different to Silviya's. I think that once privacy campaigners get a hold of any sort of tracking thing, those numbers could change quite quickly. I think when you look at international examples, the only ones that are really comparable are essentially zonal cordon-based schemes. I think the point that Nick made about predictability of fares is absolutely right. I think one of the successes of the Oyster system is that capping as well. Actually, if you're a small business and you just know that you're going to have to drive day in, day out to get between jobs, being able to budget for that at the start of the month is what you want, right? And you don't want that uncertainty. And I think for me, I think the more interesting way that technology that we can be thinking about the technology is less in terms of tracking people, but more in terms of giving a personalised experience and a personalised charge. So I completely agree. Looking at PTAL or an equivalent. I know committee members may have views on the effectiveness of.
Can you explain PTAL?
Public transport accessibility levels. A measure available for how good public transport is in a postcode. So people's cars are registered to postcodes. Those postcodes have these assessments. We've talked about income and other metrics that could be used to means test this. And actually, suddenly you've got a much more dynamic system, but it's not dynamic in a day-to-day way. It's responsive to different needs. It gives policymakers different levers to pull at different stages, and it goes with the grain of what people know now, both in terms of the sort of zonal system on public transport, but also what is essentially a central congestion charge zone, an inner London current ULEZ zone, and an outer London soon-to-be ULEZ zone. You've sort of got three cordons there already. Maybe actually the way to make some progress on this is to build on that existing technology, do something that's a little less dynamic, but gets us somewhere.
Thank you. I think Matthew wants to come in.
I just wanted to a couple of quick points on how to sort of test this. I would agree that, as I said earlier, trying to do smaller sort of minimum viable products and test groups is really something we should be looking at, because the technology with a defined group that wishes to take part in a trial could be set up in a matter of hours, given mobile phone technology, etc. So there really is the possibility for a low-cost trial to be done. And I think the other thing we're just touching on there is that people can change their behaviour in terms of time of day of travel as well. So, whilst the longer-term trend to reduce maybe vehicle miles, there is value in moving vehicle miles at different times of the day. And that's something where people and businesses can make decisions based on, clarity on what charges are and some certainty they're not going to be changing very regularly. We can maybe make more use of the time we have of our road space, because it's over time as well as the space itself. So that's something else to consider as well when we think about the charges.
Thank you, that's helpful. I want to pick up on the point that Nick made a little earlier, that if we're going to introduce this, the public have to be aware that they're getting something for it. And Nick, you made the point about with the advent of the congestion charge, the bus services were really improved in central London. Now, representing an outer London borough, the comments I get is, well, I need my car because the bus services aren't as good as they are in central London. And taking the view of trying to reduce car usage and get cars off the road, what future place is there, and should, I suppose, TfL or other bodies be investing more in, for example, car clubs, or encouraging passengers to share journeys together? Is that a feasible thing, do you think? I don't know who wants to. Adam, you want to go first?
I'm happy to just quickly pick up on that. I think you're absolutely right. I think this doesn't need to be an anti-car policy. And actually, in many ways, if you're getting a more reliable journey when you do need to use your car, that is a pro-car policy. And I think there's a challenge here in terms of, and again, this is pay per mile is fairer in terms of usage, but it might do less in terms of some of those marginal unnecessary journeys. If you haven't used your car yet today, should I pop to the shops in my car at the end of the day or not? Those are the sorts of journeys. And there's, again, we need to do a lot more work. We need to do a lot of modelling and all the rest of it to understand what these impacts would be. But maybe that would be better at targeting those unnecessary journeys. And I completely agree on car clubs. I think, and I know this is something the committee has looked at before.
Recently, yes.
And actually, I think this is where TfL, there is a strain of thought in TfL that it is a public transport body, but there is a tension there with its role as an integrated transport authority and regulator. And I think this is one of those areas where that shines through. I'd love to see Cars for London with roundels on the side, one integrated scheme that works across the city, because part of this is people don't live their lives by borough boundaries. And at the moment, schemes are borough by borough. We see the same with shared micro-mobility. We are not set up to deliver the shift to shared mobility. And if we think about we have a fixed supply of road space in London, apart from some marginal, pinch points, river crossings and things that are absolutely essential to expand. We essentially can't create more of it. What we can do is choose to allocate it differently. And a vast, vast amount of it is given over to lumps of metal that sit idle for 96% of the time. If you could just, some people will need to own a car, but if you could just do away with, let's say, half on a residential street and replace that with car clubs, with a reliable car club system, you've created an extra lane on every residential street in London. And, that could be the high street shops spilling over, pubs and cafes in the street, as we've seen through the pandemic. It could be a bus lane, it could be a cycle lane. There are all sorts of things we can do with that space, or it could just allow cars to flow more freely. But thinking about how we change the ownership model absolutely has to be part of this, and it can't just be a charging scheme. It's got to be, how do we make London's roads better as part of making London's transport system better?
Thank you. I think one of the comments I made at our recent investigation to car clubs was that my borough straddles the North Circular. And north of the North Circular, there's virtually no cars at the car club. So I often have to get the bus to go down a bit further in to get a vehicle of a car club to use. So there is issues there. But Nick, I think you indicated earlier, and I have Carolyn as well.
And just to make a declaration again, I am a member of a car club, and because I do drive and I do use the car club, and for those journeys, go to IKEA, B&Q, that kind of thing, where I can't strap it to the front of my bike or get it on the bus. I think there is a bit of an attitude that cars are cars are cars in TfL. I think, as Adam said, that they don't look at a hierarchy within that, and I think car clubs need to be treated differently. If we're going to achieve the modal shift targets that are in the Mayor's transport strategy and achieve net zero, we've got to make even more progress in outer London than we do in inner London. So that has to be a focus of investment in public transport and alternatives. Micromobility, I think, has got an increasing role to play, particularly in outer London. I think it's not currently maximised. It's very focused at the moment on inner London. The point about you've got to know what you're going to get in return is really important. And obviously we've talked about how the buses were improved ahead of the congestion charge and how something similar would probably need to happen for this. I think there's another element to this. We so normalise congestion in the city. We're so used to it. It's so factored in. We all know it's a headache. We all know that we don't like sitting in traffic. But it's just part of life. I don't actually think we really understand the value and the cost of that. I don't think businesses do, because I think it's so factored in. And I think just as ahead of ULEZ, a lot of the messaging was around these are the public health benefits that will come from improving health. I think a lot more work needs to be done at looking at what the actual financial benefits would be from tackling congestion. I had my boiler service recently by British Gas, and as is often the case, you get like a 7-hour window that they're going to come in, and they can't be any more precise than that. And one of the reasons for that is because they don't know what traffic's going to be like. The guy came to do my boiler. It took him an hour and a half to drive to Lewisham from Brixton. And just imagine how many more home visits you could do a day if congestion had been reduced. And to pay, say, £20 extra for that van to drive around, they could do another 7, 8, 9, 10, 20 home calls. There is but I don't think we really understand and have disentangled this enough, because it's just so part of life that we just assume it, and it's factored in. Businesses know it's a cost, but I don't think they quite know how much they would probably benefit from tackling this. So if this is going to be sold to Londoners, particularly small businesses, I think that is where you're going to have to focus a lot on what we're going to get out of this.
Thank you. I think TfL's own figures show that congestion cost over £5 billion per year. To
how you bring that alive for the individual is going to be the real challenge.
Yeah. Carolyn.
I just wanted to, second what you guys said about car clubs. So although I am the Car Free London campaigner, it is the Car Free London campaign. We are actually, big fans of car clubs, and obviously that does represent an opportunity to reduce the amount of space that's given over to cars, as Adam was saying, and that, can open up all sorts of possibilities in terms of more equitable use of space. And I think also having something like Cars for London, where we've got a scheme that is the same London-wide, as Adam was saying, would have great benefits. I think the issue with some of the, the private micromobility schemes, obviously there's lots of issues there, but I took a Lime bike to cycle through central London the other day, and it cost me like £12 or £13, so I thought, well, I won't be doing that again. I think people do need to know in advance, how much they're going to be paying. And I think if there is a way, as Nick has talked about, that the public transport can be improved, particularly in the outer boroughs, in advance of bringing in the pay-as-you-drive, that will really help. Otherwise, it's a question of, trying to get the message across that that's going to come afterwards, that people will see the improvements. It's so key that the revenue is all hypothecated into improving public transport and sustainable transport, so that people do understand, as everyone's been saying, that they're getting something in return for this. I think that's all I was going to say.
Thank you. I think Silviya wants to come in, but as you answer, can I also pose another question to you? What about specific tolls that might exist in London at the moment? For example, the ones proposed for Silvertown Tunnel or the Dartford crossing, for example. Should they be rolled in, or will they stand as standalone charges? Silviya, do you have a view?
Just to add very quickly on the car club and car share points, I think just charging by distance per car is in itself an incentive to car share and to use shared cars more effectively and more efficiently. So I think that will have a big factor, because we've seen car occupancy levels really decline during the pandemic. So it's important to incentivize that more efficient use of cars that are already on the road, and reduce car ownership to that effect. I think I often struggle because we don't have a car, and I find it baffling that when we're going to a school party, for example, to a birthday party, other parents that do have cars don't think to offer a lift, and it's something that we need to change culturally as well. On the question of those, yes, I think if we do have a comprehensive road user charging system in London, all existing charging schemes do need to be rolled into it, and that would be a key attraction to businesses and to private drivers as well, to have the simplicity of one scheme.
Thank you, Nick.
I agree with that. I think if you're going to make it as simple as possible, you would you would ideally roll in to the charge the Silvertown Tunnel toll. But it opens an interesting question about river crossings in general. I'm not sure if the Assembly's done any work on this. Forgive me if you have, but obviously there's a problem about how we fund, repair, maintain, and build new river crossings. In fact, very complicated ownership of bridges and tunnels and income streams. I thought perhaps you'd done work on this, and and it's been a problem for a long time. They're not classed as a strategic asset, which is a very kind of strange thing in its own right. But you could hypothecate within the a road user charging scheme a certain amount to go towards the upkeep of all London's bridges. Maybe you charge a slightly higher rate to cross the river within the scheme and generate an income stream that could be used to upkeep all of the city's bridges, and perhaps be dedicated towards increasing the number of river crossings, actually.
Yeah, thank you. And as you've heard by the mutterings, we did do a report about 2 years ago. No, yes, but Adam, I think
I'm
Carolyn
sure that was
well.
it was in the back of my mind.
Just very quickly, I would not want to, again at this stage, limit the hypothecation to public transport or to public transport plus river crossings. I think if road users are paying, they will demand and expect a better road service. And there are, it's not just bridge structures that are in a bad state. TfL, I think, got about 40-something major structures at the moment that are operating with interim sort of safety measures because of the lack of funding. And I think, it will be a difficult conversation, but there's a conversation here to be had between the GLA and the boroughs. Given that the boroughs are in control of 95% of London's roads, as we all know, about how do we make this work for everyone, and how do we end up with a better road network at the end of it.
Yeah. And Carolyn.
So something that we would like to see possible in advance of the full road user charging being brought in is a toll for the river crossings for single occupancy cars. And obviously there could be exemptions. There would need to be exemptions for those, who might need to drive for mobility reasons. There could be, for businesses, an option to pay a sort of annual fee or something instead. And that could also help with the cost of the upkeep for the bridges.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, that was all really, really interesting and shows, I think, how knotty it all can be. I very much took on board from that the importance of knowing the cost in advance. And to declare my interest, I'm a member of a car club and I rent some of the bikes, and I've definitely experienced that slight shock at because it charges you by time, not distance, not really being able to predict how much it would cost you, which I don't think you have with car clubs because you rent them by the hour and there's no... Anyway, these are all to be thought about. So 2 things. Adam, one of the things that came up was the idea that we could vary it by the amount of congestion there currently is on the roads and charge less for less congested times. Obviously, that has implications for nighttime and businesses. And I just wanted to ask very quickly if businesses thought about how easy it would be to adapt to doing more driving at night if the economics of that became quite imperative.
I think clearly some businesses will be able to and some businesses won't. I'm sure Nick doesn't want his boiler serviced at 3 a.m. But there is a revolution is perhaps overused word, but in how we are moving around, and particularly on the roads, and it's happening everywhere, and businesses are responding to that in different ways. And I think there are good examples in terms of consolidation, and in terms of businesses in the same buildings coordinating their deliveries and servicing needs, and but I think there's more that can be done in terms of policy in thinking about those last mile deliveries, to slightly stray into a different topic. But in terms of timings, I think this should be an opportunity to revisit existing policy. At the moment, policy for freight focuses on limiting peak peak hour movements, peaks as defined in a sort of very pre-pandemic way? Are those the most appropriate targets for the world that we now live in? Again, this should be an opportunity to look at all of that, because I think businesses are open. Again, if it's going to save them money, if it's going to be more efficient, if it's going to limit their carbon footprint, they're open to exploring all of these things. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to call a break in a moment, but I was kind of hoping one of the political groups might ask this question, and we haven't touched on it yet. Does anyone have in mind how much it would be on average per mile? I'm just looking at bus fares, for example. It's 165 to catch a bus. I think an average bus journey is about 3 miles. That's 4.8 kilometres. So that's 34p a kilometre to catch the bus on average in London. Maybe a bit lower because of the hopper. So it might be 30 or 25p. Have any of you thought about the amount of cost that drivers might be able to be prepared to pay, or alternatively, from the other direction, how much it would be needed to charge in order to actually reduce congestion? Does anyone have a per kilometre number they might want to float around the room for us? Is anyone brave enough? Oh, Assembly member wants to give evidence. Go on, Assembly member Prince, you're starting with 2p. Okay, thank you very much. Any advance on that? Because that's considerably less than a bus is paid for at the moment.
I don't have a figure to hand. I mean, again, I defer to Silviya, who did the work for Centre for London before I joined, and I think maybe there was some thought put into it then. But I think it comes back to the point I made before about we need to be really clear about what the actual cost of congestion is as well, because I think if you can equate how much you pay relative to how much you may end up saving, it may be more palatable. So I think one's determined by the other in many respects, but it's got to be simple and clearly understandable in advance.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about congestion. I think the estimate we've got on the cost of congestion is £5.1 billion a year. I'm not sure how many kilometres we do, but we can probably work out the cost from that. Adam?
When we sort of floated this idea of a 3-zone cordon-based scheme earlier in the year, to throw into the discussion more than to say this is the solution, just to sort of demonstrate, and to be absolutely clear, we have not modelled this in with great rigour, but the sort of thought experiment was, how do you defend driving all day in outer London costing less than a bus fare? Actually, a daily charge for using your vehicle in outer London of £1.65, and as a starting point, and obviously you can vary, as we talked about, vary that by individual and circumstances. But if you could start with some fairly low costs here. Maybe inner London is twice that, and if you did that, that would probably raise the same as the congestion charge does now. That's a significant chunk of money for TfL to start investing in those improvements before we start doing anything more significant in terms of pricing. But why should it be cheaper to drive to the shops than get the bus?
Thank you very much. And I'm not necessarily just interested in throwing numbers around, but looking at the terms in which we might do that kind of thought experiment. And I think it is really useful to use the bus as a comparator when we do that. Any more guests want to contribute? Any thoughts? We may ask for contributions in writing as well. In that case, I will call a short adjournment so we can all have a comfort break. It's 33 minutes past according to my clock, so I'll reconvene at 11:40. Thank you. Cheers. Okay, we're back online. I think. Welcome back, everyone, to today's session of the London Assembly Transport Committee. If you turned your phones on to not silent, please put them back on silent again, now you've come back in the room. It's great to be talking about the nitty-gritty at this point of how we might possibly talk about doing smarter road charging within London. And the next question is actually for me and very much about the nitty-gritty. So for everyone, but I'm going to start with Sarah, if that's all right, if you've thought about it at all. I'm wondering about the complexity of your day-to-day life if you're operating under a system like this, and particularly for businesses. So what kind of practical or administrative issues do you think might be caused by a complex scheme with multiple different variables and charging levels?
I think confusion for small businesses is probably top of the list, actually. And just in terms of some of the schemes that operate just in terms of the camera technology in London, we do have members who have come to us about the PCNs, where they're already spending a lot of time dealing with PCN charges which aren't accurately charged. So that's just one example, and we have got evidence of that from those businesses that have come to us with that information, which cuts across the TfL area where there's road charges and management in place, but also across the boroughs as well. So I think it's the confusion absolutely needs to be completely taken away for small businesses with any future charging scheme. They need to have clear information. They need to have a long lead-in time. It needs to be costed out where it's as cost efficient to doing business in the capital as possible. I mean, London's a city of business, but for small businesses, it doesn't feel like that. The cost of living and the cost of doing business is extremely high at the moment, and it looks like it continues to be that way for businesses. And I think any scheme coming in needs to be clearly communicated about how much it's going to cost them to do business on a day-by-day basis. And I know different things have been discussed today. Members and businesses who completed our surveys, the 2 surveys in 2021 and 2022, the clear thing that came across was it has to be fair, it has to be affordable for us to be able to continue to do our business in London. Otherwise, they will have to stop doing their business in London, which isn't what we want.
Okay, that's really clear. And I think, the last set of questions we talked about, the ability to budget being very important. And I think that's probably even more true for businesses. And so the idea of retrospective charging, prospective knowledge of the charges ahead of time rather than retrospective charging, would that also, in this sort of question, the sense I'm asking now, would that also cause less appeals, fewer complaints, do you think?
I think that would have to wait and see. But I know, just to give the example again about the PCN charges for where businesses, van drivers have been in locations in different boroughs across London where they've got a right to be and have been penalised, and then spending a lot of time trying to deal with those appeals and the appeal process. I mean, one business that really stands out to me, a property maintenance company, whose accountant he has employed to deal with accounts. That person within his organisation and within his business has now spending most of their time on dealing with appeals across the different boroughs for incorrect PCNs. So that's just one example where that's obviously PCN. So if you've got road scheme charging and any penalties or issues, how is that going to affect another small business and all the small businesses across London?
Okay, thank you very much. Adam, do you have views on this? Have you got any sense of the existing costs to businesses in London of appealing the current charges?
Well, I think it's not just about appealing the current charges. It's that businesses are increasingly finding that there is no legal way for them to go about doing their business. You know, actually having to accept PCNs as a cost of doing business because of the way that we manage or don't manage our curb space. And so, this comes back to how integrated do you want this scheme to be? If you start taking on curb management and parking, you run the risk of over-complexifying a scheme and therefore it never getting off the ground. But ultimately, the more we can think about the way in which road use is changing, the way in which we want it to change, and design a package of measures, of which one of them is potentially a different form of charging for use, but it's not it's not a silver bullet in terms of all the challenges on our roads.
Thank you very much. We've temporarily lost Silviya, who might have views on this because of Wi-Fi problems at home. If I can just go to Nick, meanwhile then. You mentioned before the fact that, by and large, Londoners trust the contactless system, and there are probably very few complaints about that. Is there any sort of lessons from that, you think, in practical terms? Could something similar work, a daily cap, or would that be dangerous in policy terms?
I think knowing that there's a cap is one of the reasons why people trust their contactless pay-as-you-go, because they know that you tap in and out 6, 7, 8 times beyond a certain limit, you're not going to get charged anymore, and we trust that. Actually, the ticketing system is still very complex in London. We look at ticketing outside of London and think it's complicated, but London's is not simple with zonal systems and things like that. But we still trust it, and I think that that is one of the reasons why it was so successful. I'm sure we may come on to the privacy point in a bit, but we're all being tracked in our movements by through that system too, in terms of touching in and out, and through contactless, just as we were with Oyster cards too. And I think that we broadly accept that too. And I wonder whether, again, that's just related to the kind of trust in the brand, and that we don't think that information is going to be abused or mislaid. And I think, again, that's a really critical factor.
Thank you very much. I wonder how many people still have unregistered Oyster cards. We might want to try and find that out. Assemblymember Baker.
Yes, no, absolutely. Just a really brief follow-up on that. Which is because I was just thinking, because we keep touching on complexity, and I know we're going to ask shortly about specific exemptions and stuff like that, so I don't want to get into the detail of that. But and I was just struck, honestly, just before you said it, Nick, about, well, our fare system is incredibly complex. We have zones, we have then different bits that are also extra. We have it's not pay per mile. People don't, at the moment, feel the need to be. There's concessions. There are ways of getting free journeys. Work pays for some. I mean, why are we so worried about it being so complex when actually? I mean, I accept you're saying about the brand and it's not public transport, but why couldn't it mirror the public transport system? Caroline is looking at me extremely worried, but why couldn't it mirror the public transport system?
Well, I'm a South Londoner, and the zonal system's not very favourable to South London.
Fair. So, I know. We're talking about that next year, so we'll come get you back then.
But that's a product of the fact that there are other agencies involved in that system, and not just TfL. I think if TfL were, it probably would be a lot simpler. Yeah. But I think that, again, is because we just trust the system to charge us the right charge. Having said that, there are people, and we mustn't forget this, who every day are thinking about every single penny that they spend, and probably don't touch in and out like a lot of us do, and not think about, actually, can I afford this? A lot of people still do struggle. I do recall seeing nearly every morning when I used to travel through Tooting Broadway, somebody taking coins out of a money bag to buy a ticket when you could still put lots of money into machines. And I used to think, that person, every penny really counts. They haven't got a bank account, possibly they haven't got a card. So there is still a lot of people for whom trusting the system's not the issue. It's about whether they've got any money. And they've got cash and maybe not bank accounts. So I think that's a really important factor to just bear in mind when it comes to who trusts the system, and not all of us are in the same boat.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it wasn't really a comment on the trusting about how much, whether you could afford it or something like that. It's about how complex can we get to make sure it's fair.
The really complicated one, which I've still got my head around, is the charges on the Elizabeth line to go to Heathrow, which become particularly complicated and have its own zone, basically.
Yeah, I was being berated about that in a pub last week, but that's not a subject from now. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. It's not on our list of questions, and we didn't think of it in advance, but I think that's a good point too about digital exclusion. We fought as a committee and as assembly for the retention of cash on some of the ticket machines. and ticket officers, just so that people aren't aren't excluded, and bank account exclusion. The question is how far that goes in car owners, I guess, and we'd need to maybe find out more about that at some point. So I don't know who we're going to have them as a guest at our next meeting, and this is London Travel Watch. They currently are the appeals body for ULEZ. They have a role in that, and they also have a strong role in representing public transport passengers. So do you think that should be the representative of the users of road charging? Should it be anyone else? And I don't know. This is to anyone who might have a thought on this. Adam, you're raising your hand.
A quick non-answer, which is that Londoners are not drivers or public transport users. I don't think anyone in this room is a single mode traveller, and the more we can think about these things holistically, generally, the better. You know, actually, I want the roads to be reliable when I'm in a taxi or when I hire a car. I want, you know, the roads to be safe when I'm on a bike. I want public transport to be reliable and efficient when I'm taking that. And I think the more we can think about this as Londoners and present it as a challenge for Londoners' whole lives, you know, I think, and the way that we actually move around, the better. So if we're going to have appeals bodies, it sort of makes sense for it to be, you know, as much as possible one thing that you know, because that makes it easy for Londoners to know where to go if they've got an issue.
Okay, thank you very much. We have got Silviya back now. Oh, sorry, Nick, go on, you come back, and Silviya, we'll come to you in a moment with a question I think you missed a moment ago.
I agree with Adam. I think it'd be silly to kind of create another organisation to try and do this when there's one already there. But Travel Watch would be overwhelmed, I imagine, in its current form by having to deal with all of the kind of complaints and appeals from millions of car users every day. So it would need probably better resourcing. But given the amount of income that the scheme's likely to generate, there's no reason why that couldn't happen.
Excellent. We'll put that to them and to TfL hopefully at the next meeting. Silviya, thank you for joining us again. I'm really sorry that we lost you for a few minutes there. The question I had prior to this question about London Travel Watch and who should represent people in complaints was essentially one of complexity and the likelihood that there would be confusion and complaints and mischarging, and how do you think those kinds of practical or administrative issues might manifest themselves, and what might be done about it, if you've thought about that at all?
To be honest, it's not something I have given much thought. Obviously, the more complicated the system is, the more difficult it is to understand, the more likely it is that issues like that will arise. And there is that trade-off between simplicity and fairness. We need to be thinking about, do we want a fully smart system? Do we want something in between? Do we want something where people can opt out and just pay an annual charge or a daily or monthly charge, depending on the type of car they have, depending on where they live, or the average sort of vehicle mileage that they have? So there are ways to get around it. But yes, in terms of, I guess, the more complicated kind of charge would suit some type of people, but not others. So we need to think about how it relates to different people's needs. I wanted to add on the earlier question about how much we might charge per mile. It's not something that we've modeled in great detail, but for the Green Light report, Arup did some modeling for the Centre for London on this. And while it's not really possible to put a per mile charge, because by definition the charge would vary based on what you're driving and when and where, it's something that is possible to model based on the outcomes that you require, whether that's vehicle reduction, whether it's revenue raised, whether it's congestion levels on certain roads. It's possible to model that based on the system that you design.
Okay, thank you very much. And Assembly Member Baker has a quick question. We're going to have to move on quickly, though. We're running out of time a little bit.
Sorry, I'm too interested in this, clearly. I just wanted to, Silviya, just sort of probe slightly, because I'm really not now convinced that complexity automatically means confusion. And I just want to say that is it not possible to have a scheme that is complex at the back end but is simple to engage with at the front end? So surely the complexity is about certain types of usage rather than there just being lots of variables, and whether that's something that's possible to look into, or whether you're just like, no, it needs to be as simple as possible.
I believe that was a question directed to Silviya, but has she frozen up? We could write to Silviya with that question at the end.
That's
of
fine.
The meeting.
Yeah, no,
we'll be sending
absolutely.
a few supplementaries back to people. And then Adam and Nick
just
have both
just very
raised their hands,
quickly.
I think, yeah.
I think instinctively, I think you're right. I think historically we've used the back end as a proxy for the front end when thinking about complexity and user experience, and we can't
I think
let
you're right. It very much... Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Silviya, you've gone on a long delay, as far as I can tell. Yeah, we'll just let Adam finish and we'll come back to you.
Don't let the transport planners and software engineers win that one. It's, focus on what matters, which is the user experience, and we can do all sorts of clever stuff in the background if it feels simple at the front end. Is my guess on that one. But again, we need to understand what Londoners really think on this.
Nice, thank you. Silviya, do you want to try again?
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm on my mobile hotspot because my connection has been disrupted for about half an hour now. But no, it's just to say that it is possible to do that, but it still needs to be sort of the charging system about what you're charging for when. That's the bit that should be easy to understand. I mean, it's possible to simplify that with an app, but again, you need to bear in mind that there might be people that don't have access to technology on a daily basis.
All right, thank you very much. So handing over now to Assemblymember Prince. Oh, sorry, Nick.
I was only going to say that I think in theory having a complex back end and a simple front end is fine, but that comes back to what your objective is from the scheme. If the objective is reducing congestion, you might need to have quite a complicated surge charging scheme, depending on where you're driving and what the particular problems are, where they are. And I don't think you could do that with a simple front end. It starts to make it more complicated. If it's just about raising income, generating revenue for TfL, then I think you can have a very simple front end. So I think it comes down to what you want to get out of the scheme and how clear you are about that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I forgot. Assemblymember Prince, you're on the next question.
Thank you, Chair. I'll ask this to Nick, actually. Nick, has there any work been done on who would be the winners and losers in such a scheme as a road user charging scheme?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm sure that there has been. I'm afraid I don't know, but I think instinctively, obviously, there are going to be many winners and losers depending on how often you use your vehicle. And I think those businesses that drive around all day are, in theory, going to be the ones that are going to end up paying more. And then it comes back to that point I made earlier about we need to be really clear about what the cost has been historically to them being stuck in traffic. If you only drive your car once a day to take your kids to school, where previously you might have paid £15, you may only pay 25p. So I think instinctively it comes down to how often you use your vehicle. Probably the times of day, but I'm not aware of any particular research. I hate to keep deferring to Silviya, but I suspect that she probably does know.
Come to a minute, just coming back to you on that. There could therefore be an argument for capping, perhaps.
Well, I think capping again makes it people trust it. Will trust it more. Again, it comes back to the contactless pay as you go. The fact that people know that they won't go above a certain amount every day. It means people trust it. The issue then becomes, well, what is the cap? Because if the aim of the scheme is to try and reduce the amount that people use their vehicles, you don't want to have it too low, because obviously then once you get past, say, £5 a day, you could drive your vehicle as much as you want, which is a similar problem to what there is obviously with a congestion charge, because once you've paid your congestion charge fee, you could drive around central London as much as you like. and you pay the same if you just skirt into it for 15 seconds. So it's not the flat charge is a kind of cap in its own right, but there's no gradations below it at the moment. So I think it just becomes a question of where you set it.
So if I can ask Silviya, please, if she's there.
Yes, I think the simple answer is that there isn't a simple answer today because we don't know what the scheme will look like. It very much depends on how the scheme is designed. But I mean, obviously, as with all charges, it's people on low incomes, people that don't have access to alternatives, high volume users like sole traders and businesses when you're charging per distance. But yes, as you say, there are a number of mitigations that you can deploy in that regard. So you could have capping, which is based on per day, per week, per month. There are many variations on this. You can vary that by type of business. You can vary that by postcode. You can have lower rates of charge per mile for certain users. You can have tax-free mileage allowance. There are many different mitigations that you can deploy in addition to incentives to switch to a cleaner vehicle and then pay a lower rate because of that. So a number of options, in short.
That kind of answers my next question, actually. But is there any? Have you done any research to find out what public opinion is like on this at all, as to what exemptions there should be, or what groups should be exempted, or anything?
Yes, so I'm just trying to find a specific data table on this. Key workers, I think, were the people of key concern to Londoners, alongside people who drive for a livelihood. I've got a detailed number breakdown. I can put that in a formal written submission. But people with no access to alternatives as well were the group of people that Londoners were concerned about. In terms of mitigations, there is a 50-50 split between people think that mitigations or exemptions are necessary in order to ensure fairness of the scheme. But there's also about half of people who think that those sorts of mitigations might be used by people as a way to cheat the system. So it's very important to be balanced about what mitigations you provide and how necessary they are in order to mitigate the impacts for some of the losers.
How do you mitigate, though, against fraud and abuse? So we have issues with, say, the blue badges that are abused. If you were to, say, give a key worker an exemption, it's the car you give the exemption to, not the individual. And then, of course, you'd have a situation where everybody in the household could use that registered car. And how would you detect that the right person wasn't in the car?
That really is the difficulty with it, and that is the problem of having too many, exemptions and mitigations. You need to really judge the balance of it right for something that is necessary. And yes, whether you attach the exemption to the person or to the vehicle, that's a very legitimate question to look at. So lots of questions to consider when you're designing that.
All right, thank you. Oh, sorry, Matthew.
Yeah, I was just going to come in with another answer to that question. I think as things have moved on, I mean, I used to spend a lot of time working at TfL on the contactless scheme. But now with the data that we have of journeys, go back to your example around, key workers. Is it just if you are a key worker, you get to drive around at a different rate, or do you get to drive certain journeys at a certain rate? And what we're finding is the amount of data that is now available and what we can do with it, enables a much more accurate way of charging people and understanding and getting other cross-reference data to confirm particular journeys. So, I think the world is changing a lot in terms of the data available to make the charging sort of more accurate and offer a better service. I think coming back to Adam's point around this is really trying to create a good service that's available for Londoners.
Yeah, but if you're a district nurse, you go all over the place, don't you?
Yeah, but that would be known. So if you know a district nurse is, I'm travelling in this area, this is what I do, then that's fine. You've got the example of working out if the fraud is taking place as you're examining, of saying someone else borrows the car to go and drive elsewhere, etc. You can see what the patterns are, and that pattern matching and understanding can offer a better way of being more accurate.
Thank you.
Just quickly, I think we need to be aware that these schemes take a long time to design and should have a long shelf life. And in order to have that longevity, you're going to need to be able to adapt it for different policy scenarios in the future. And I think the blunter tools that we have at the moment don't offer that so much. So I think discounts are much better than exemptions in terms of mitigation, because it's very hard to unexempt someone or a group of people for any of these schemes. It's easier to vary rates and vary discounts to reflect new policy scenarios. And just on the capping point, I think it's very hard to justify a tube fare cap that is essentially for white collar workers in the centre of London who have to get between lots of meetings in a day, and not have a cap for builders in outer London who need to get to lots of jobs in a day. I think that's a very direct comparison, and there's a sense of fairness across the whole system.
Nick?
Just to add to that, I guess it really just comes down to this point about whether a scheme is going to be based on a vehicle or an individual. We know from congestion charge and ULEZ that you come up against challenges with blue badge holders because they're an individual, not a vehicle. And with ULEZ and congestion charge, I think there is a scheme that you can claim it back if you're visiting a hospital for you've got a serious illness, but it's after the event and you've got to claim it back, and it's really clunky and it's not massively well advertised, and I don't know how many people actually do it because the scheme's not based on individuals but on vehicles. If you stick with a cordon scheme, which is obviously some kind of number plate recognition, then you are going to be stuck a bit with a vehicle-based scheme. But if you want to go to a scheme that is using GPS, then you could use mobile phones. Most people have those, and they've got tracking devices in them. So I think the technology allows you perhaps to be much more sophisticated in the exemptions based on individuals rather than vehicles.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So moving on to Assembly Member Sheikh for some questions about public engagement.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's sort of just building on the line of questioning that we've been having, which is this kind of ongoing conversation around complexity versus fairness, and how do we sort of navigate it in a way that meets the needs of Londoners. So I think what I'd like to do is start by speaking to Silviya specifically in regarding to some of the respondents you had to your survey. So your road pricing survey found that the majority of Londoners supported having reduced rates or higher tax-free driving allowances for designated key workers, for people on welfare or low incomes, for people whose job requires them to drive. So I think this probably leans into that kind of conversation we're having around people are willing to get on board with a slightly more complex system if it enables fairness for particularly key workers. I think maybe particularly post-pandemic, I think there's a realisation that these are workers that need additional support. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the survey that your organisation did, and why you think the respondents were in favour of, I guess, to put it simply, complexity in order to meet fairness.
I guess, yes, the question is that about having the most appropriate mitigation. As Adam said earlier, exemptions might not be the best targeted option, but reduced rates and higher allowances might be a better option that you can then tailor accordingly. Key workers is a category that has been better defined with the pandemic, but it's also a very big group that you need to consider in terms of the balance of benefits and costs of providing that sort of discount, and whether it's something that you can justify and for what means. And the other sort of thing to quantify, to sort of qualify that finding is the conflict between people who think that this exemption is justified and required for fairness purposes versus those that think that, well, if people, so something we heard in the focus groups was, for example, people on benefits. Some low-income workers were saying, well, I work and I pay my tax. I'm still on the low income, but why should someone that doesn't work and doesn't go out as regularly need to get a discount? So there's all these sort of complications that arise when you try to draw a line between who needs to be, who can qualify for what sort of reduction or discount and who doesn't. So there's potential for conflict there, in addition to the complication about people trying to cheat the system or sort of get away with certain, basically to claim that they're part of a group that they might not be. So there's a lot of complication basically that arises from mitigation, and that's why there's those two questions in the survey need to be considered together essentially.
Do you have any suggestions in terms of how to navigate that confliction, that tension between perhaps different groups?
Well, my suggestion would be to not use exemptions, but to use discounts or certain allowances, because then it's something that you can, as Adam said, to change as and when necessary. To use also established groups of categories of people. So, for example, disabled people or blue badge holders, it's an established category. For key workers, yes, it has been sort of accepted during the pandemic, but do we have a clear definition to that extent, or do we need to do assessments of individuals whether they're eligible or not? I think that would be the sort of discussion that you need to have.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And I might even just bring Carolyn on this, because obviously your organisation, it would just be good to hear how internally the conversations have taken place for yourselves around, the fact that disabled people will often need to use a car to get around. So could you just give us some information about which groups of people you think should be supported continuing to using a group, and in that context offer some commentary around how we can support disabled Londoners in this transition?
Well, I think what Silviya just said about using blue badge holders as an existing category is really important, and I think consulting with disabled people's organisations, especially those that work in transport, will be really important to get the views of disabled people around how this can be made fair and take their needs on board.
Okay, thank you. Adam, I wanted to bring you in on a question that moves us towards discussing how we can better engage with businesses around this. And I think, sorry, excuse the sniffles, everyone. Your response to the ULEZ consultation talked about the principles for road user charging, with the second principle that the scheme recognises where and for whom alternative transport options exist. Sorry, actually, this isn't around businesses. This is more to do with poor transport links, but I'll come on to talking about businesses next. So you give example that postcodes with poor access to public transport could be charged a lower rate, as could businesses that can demonstrate they have no other option if they are able to trade. Would you agree that any scheme should recognise that not everyone in London is able to rely on active public transport? Now, I know you've already referred to this particular topic of area, but I'd love some more elaboration if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the end goal is a city that works, right, and a city that works for everyone. And Londoners rely on all sorts of businesses to provide them with all sorts of goods and services. They rely on the road network to access other services and employment. And I think we need to go through a process of understanding this in real depth before we make decisions. We're clearly, there's a range of starting points in terms of people's views here, but we don't. The fundamental answer is we don't know at the moment, because part of what we're trying to do is work out where's the overlap between the right thing to do and what Londoners will accept, and that's going to take a lot of conversation, and it's going to take bringing people in, and it's going to take working through some of these knotty issues, and we're going to see, as we've seen with the bus consultation recently, as we've seen with the ULEZ consultation, when Londoners are involved, we end up with better schemes.
Absolutely, and sort of just building on that point, what kind of public engagement and consultations, including with businesses, will be necessary for the Mayor and the Transport of London to put ahead of putting any proposals together? So we're obviously all keen for it, but do you have a a steer on the most effective way of doing that kind of consultation, and more than consultation, sort of like perhaps be part of the forming of these proposals before you're consulted on them.
Absolutely. I think you can't just rely on formal consultation mechanisms. I think it's good that a very broad question around this was included in the ULEZ consultation over the summer. I think you're getting people thinking about this, engaging with it, and helping to shape it from an early stage is really important. But I think it also needs to be said that changes of this magnitude have only worked when there's been really strong political leadership as well. Ken knew exactly what he wanted to do and how he was going to do it when he arrived with the congestion charge. Current mayor has been similarly clear about air quality and ULEZ, and there are lots of Londoners who don't decide to engage with TfL consultations on a regular basis, and so actually those sort of broader campaigns and that clear leadership is really important.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, I think that balance between clear political vision but also doing enough to bring people on that journey with you and having them be part of shaping it is essential. Nick, I don't know if you wanted to come in on this, or if any of our guests online wanted to come in on this before I pass back to the chair.
Yeah, just to say that it comes back to a point I made earlier about you've got to be really clear about what the objective is or objectives. And with congestion charge and ULEZ, it did what it said on the tin, so it kind of partly did the job. One was about tackling congestion, one was about tackling air quality, and the narrative was built around those. When the conversation started with Londoners, ULEZ was fronted up as a public health benefit, and a lot of the data was used to illustrate how many people suffered from bad health as a result of poor air quality in London as part of that conversation. And I think if you're talking to businesses in particular, it comes back to this point about being able to articulate to them how much congestion's costing them and how much, therefore, they may save as a result of this scheme working properly. So I think you've got to have that type of information in advance. I don't think you can just be passive about putting the scheme out there and asking for people's views on it. It is a bit of a public relations exercise in many ways.
Thank you. I think we're still fine-tuning our tools around it as well. Thank you for that, Nick. Sarah, am I correct in understanding you've indicated online? Nope, Silviya, not Sarah. Nope, both. Sarah and then Silviya.
Oh, thank you. No, it was just to sort of add some further points to the points we just raised, the good points and valid points raised. Just thinking about, obviously, the consultation that was done over the summer by TfL and that one question that was about future road charging. It would be probably a great idea to sort of take the answers and the feedback that Londoners gave to that particular sort of suite of questions and build on that and take that forward from today onwards, that businesses and residents feel that these are the next steps from that consultation, that there will be further consultation and clear consultation. They can feel very much a part of the movement going forwards, and absolutely essential that from a business perspective, that businesses do have an opportunity to be very much involved in the sort of the pre-proposals, the pre-scheme planning, and what works really well for businesses. And just thinking about the word discounts, further exemptions, I think discounts is probably the right word to use. I know that was mentioned by both Silviya and Adam. Discounts for businesses. So, for example, if you've got businesses who actually depend on their vehicles for their livelihoods, travelling around the Greater London, Central London area, taking, for example, a plumbing business that has to carry their equipment on board their vans. They might have more than one van. They might be a small company that's got several vans, and maybe there could be a discounts for them, either for one particular vehicle for a year, or some sort of discount scheme where the more vehicles they've got, they do get a discount on their cost of travelling with a future scheme. And then just thinking about the Greater London region, obviously the public transport is not so good at all as Central London. And in terms of some of the southern boroughs, I was in Bromley last week and one of the businesses on the high street there, they said, we don't even have an underground that comes into our borough. We have public buses, but it's not a great network. And what we're really concerned about is with the ULEZ charge, they are going to lose customers who at the moment come in from neighbouring areas outside London on a very regular basis to eat in their restaurants, support their high street. So from their perspective, they were saying a scheme like this would be better for them because they would then hopefully not lose those customers who will be facing quite a high charge just to come and eat at their restaurant, which they've enjoyed doing for many years. So that's just to give a couple of case studies there.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And Silviya, did you want to come in as well?
Yes, the points I was going to make basically reinforce what Sarah just said. But on the topic of mitigations, it's important to say that the number one and two mitigations for fairness were making public transport cheaper and improving the connectivity of public transport. That's before starting to think about discounts and exemptions for specific groups. So I think improving the alternatives will be should be number one priority in terms of tackling fairness. And secondly, in terms of how a scheme like that should be framed and consulted on, I think it's important to emphasize that this offers an opportunity for a fairer and simpler scheme than the current congestion and ULEZ charges, because it more fairly reflects how much you drive and when and where, and the alternatives that you have. So I think that's the fundamental selling point of replacing the current schemes, I think. And then on how the scheme could be designed, then it's important to involve stakeholders and representative groups at that early stage, as was already said, in terms of co-designing at the start, in addition to formal consultations.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think co-design is key. Thank you, Silviya. I'll pass back over to the chair.
Thank you very much. So to follow up on that, we also have Assemblymember Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, when we're thinking about engagement about this issue, road user charging, there's no way of sort of sugarcoating there would be an enormous change to the way that we currently structure transport and travel in London, especially in Outer London, where there's significantly higher car ownership. There's definitely a feeling of consultation fatigue out there. For example, we have a consultation running on a key transport issue in part of my constituency in Hounslow, and the response has been very sort of Brenda from Bristol, what another one, and people are feeling ignored when they do respond to these consultations. My inbox is full of people who are against the expansion of the Ultra Low Emission Zone, for example, who feel like they spent time and effort replying to a consultation to then just have their views bulldozed over. My question, I suppose, is, on something of this magnitude, how do we make sure that this is being done with people and not to people? How do we actually take people along with us and make sure that they feel that they're represented? I hear what you're saying about a PR exercise and all that sort of thing, but there also has to be a democratic mandate for this. And I guess I'm kind of throwing it open to people who could suggest how we actually properly engage with people on this and how we do take people with us rather than have something imposed on them. I don't know, Adam, you've done some engagement work on this. Do you have anything further to add on that?
I think ultimately this will be a mayoral decision, and the mayor is democratically accountable to Londoners. And we saw in 2008 what happened when there was one of the key campaign issues was the western extension of the congestion charge. So we know how this works, and everybody has their say. But equally, the mayor needs to be able to take these decisions and do things. So I think there's absolutely there's a democratic process here, and we'll know what that is. But I mean, I think I'm not sure I've got much more to add in terms of engagement. Lots of it early, and you being clear, and there's a real balance here between being clear about, as Nick's said this as well, sort of being clear about why and what we're trying to achieve and why it's important, without being prescriptive about the end state, and therefore having people feel like they're part of that journey. Say, right, so the political objective is X, and we've worked with, we've all worked together to work out which version of the route to X we want to take.
Okay, thank you. I can see Silviya indicating.
I think what you've just said is an important example of why consultations are a broad way of sort of making decisions. I think that they're a good way of sort of raising concerns and demonstrating how you're addressing them. But by definition, they're not representative of the views of the population at large. That is why it's important to use those in addition to other tools of engagement. For example, representative surveys, for example, citizen assemblies, grassroots campaigning and engagement at the local level. And that's something that campaigning organizations like ours and other NGOs can help support. I think the most important finding in a way from our survey was that people change their perceptions and overcome their initial reservations when you engage them in meaningful discussion about what a scheme means and how it can be implemented and how you can address people's concerns. So we did a very detailed 60-question survey on Pay As You Drive, and we asked people's support or opposition at the start, middle and end of the survey. And what we saw for Londoners, support increased from 46% at the start of the survey to 54% at the end, and opposition reduced from 21 to 13% at the end of the survey. And that is because we discussed ways to address people's concerns, ways that those mitigations can be provided, and explained what the system is about and how it can be, what are the different ways of implementation as well. I think that's important to take the people on that journey.
That's very interesting. Anyway, thank you, Chair. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's partly why we're here today, to demonstrate that, whether or not we just do decide as a city to go along with something like this, it's not too scary to talk about. That's the key point we're trying to make today. So we've got one more section of questions. We're running a little bit behind, but that's because it's so interesting. We've got about 20 minutes of questions on the technologies and the costs and privacy implications. So I know, Nick Bowes, you need to leave quite soon. So when you do, that's fine. Someone will help you out of the building. If the rest of you can stay on as long as you can, that would be great. Or message our team if you need to leave a bit early, and we'll say goodbye when you do. Assemblymember Pigeon, you're starting this section.
Yeah,
Thank you.
lovely. Let's pick up the technology. I'm going to go to Matthew first. We recommended in our previous work on this in 2017 that any new technology introduced for the ULEZ expansion should be compatible with future road pricing schemes. And I'm not sure if that is in reality going to happen given the rollout and where technology is. But Matthew, what technology could be used to support a smart road user charging system?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In that I spent a lot of my time at TfL with the contactless scheme, and I've seen how things have changed. So let me take an example from the motor industry. So some of this is public and some of this is sort of not necessarily public, but all new cars in about the next 18 months will know exactly where they are, and will also have the ability to pay within the car.
Wow.
So the situation where you'll be approaching a petrol station, you'll be approaching a toll gate, and clearly car manufacturers are willing to create a universal system that will allow that to happen. And I think one of the things that I would observe that has changed a bit is that there's more technology out there being provided by other people, and the challenge in London will be how to allow different payment channels to work seamlessly, how challenges in customer service can be worked seamlessly with the back end that would be run at TfL. And I think that's that's an example of some of the opportunities that are out there, notwithstanding equally being able to develop our own apps as TfL has already done in a test format. But there are many, many channels now which I think can make it easier for customers and users in London to pay this charge and understand it. And it's not necessarily in the world of a single one platform only entry into the experience of paying for the charge.
Okay, and you mentioned that an app has already been developed. What was that? Could you clarify, please?
Well, I say from my previous experience by my previous employer, when I used to talk to Silviya about this as well, they've done some testing in terms of a location-based app. And I think the principle was always that going forward, you would ask customers to share their data with the TfL back end. So again, if you compare it to Singapore, where Singapore now says, you will have one of our coders in your car, that's what you must do. And there's obviously lots of privacy issues there. A better approach might well be to say to people, we have some cameras up in London, but why don't you tell us where you went? And you can tell us in different ways. You can use Google Maps, you can use your car's software, all sorts of different technologies. And then the charge can be calculated on that basis. So again, instead of that large investment on cameras all over the city, you end up with a model where there are maybe less cameras needed because you're only confirming what data has been put in place. And I think these type of things, how people's minds have changed over sharing data, location data, is a real possibility to help reduce the costs of the scheme.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment on the type of technology we could use? I'm just looking. Is that Silviya? Do you want to?
I think that the first thing to say is that I'm not a technologist, so there's lots of sort of complicated, issues that obviously need to be sorted. But from my understanding is that obviously you can use cameras for enforcement and or for charging. But as Matthew said, the inbuilt telematics in new vehicles is something that people sort of accept and understand as well. And for those cars that don't have the connectivity capability in their vehicle, you can have a plug-in device. And from the survey that we did, the telematic GPS approach was the most attractive technology to Londoners specifically, with net support of plus 34%, so that's support minus opposition. The least attractive option was a black box, so something that insurers used, and also cameras were among the technologies that people were less supportive of. And from focus groups, my understanding is that it's something people would associate with penalties. So, for example, speeding tickets and being tracked for that purpose. But as long as you're clear that the technology is being used for that explicit purpose with enhanced encryption and privacy considerations, people are just as supportive of this as they are for the MOT read option that doesn't require tracking. And you can provide opt-outs for people that are concerned about this.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Adam wants to come in.
I think we shouldn't allow the technology to be a blocker to answering the fundamental question, which is what do we want to achieve with this? The technology will be available. We'll be able to find it. There are companies coming out of your ears who want to help design these things, as they did with contactless payments. This is not going to be a challenge. I think it's about what are we trying to achieve and what's publicly acceptable. And I think the way that we frame discussions around cameras and tracking will have a big role to play in that. And I think, as mentioned earlier, I think that as it becomes real, people's perceptions will potentially change and be shaped by campaigners and additional thoughts about these things. So I don't think we should let technology be a barrier, but we also shouldn't set the bar so high that we never get there as well. Actually, we've got cameras to enforce congestion charge and ULEZ and the LEZ, and these things exist. There's a working with the grain.
It's almost a phased approach you could have. This is our goal, but actually the first phase, using what we've got, might do this, and then ultimately, as technology develops, this is where we want to get to.
Absolutely, and I'm sceptical that people really know what's under the bonnet. I think there's whether it's in your car, whether it's in your phone, we all scroll through those terms and conditions as quickly as possible to hit accept and give away all sorts of things, which
right. Sarah, you wanted to come in on this.
No, just really sorry, it's really sort of a question maybe to Matthew. In terms of this sort of location-based app idea, could it, for example, if you were to put in your start of your journey and your end of your journey, you're a small business and you know roughly your route because you've got a number of addresses to go to on a day, you put in your route, you want to avoid the tolls, maybe at Silver Tunnel and Dartford Tunnel, for example, you want to avoid some tolls. Could you click a box where you avoid the tolls? You can maybe avoid congested routes. I don't know if you can do that. And then you get an idea as a business owner how much your day is going to cost you operating that vehicle within Greater London region.
I mean, I think everything is possible. I think what is interesting is if you structure it right with an open data approach, which again TfL has led on in the past, you will find people developing their products, to serve businesses. I mean, a lot of, maybe not for your members of the small business, but larger businesses, will already have software tracking vehicles. So this becomes the ability to, again, allow a business to develop in London. Again, if we're thinking the broader picture, if London goes first and we allow an open data so that products are developed to meet small businesses, medium businesses, large businesses' needs, that's actually a benefit for London and the UK economy. So I think there's a way of structuring this to sort of allow a market solution to some elements of this, while always recognising that there needs to be a single back end, if you like, that manages it all. So yes, these are all possible.
Lovely. And Matthew, what estimate do you think could be the likely cost of introducing such a scheme? I mean, you've touched on, getting apps and other things you may not need, I don't know, intensive camera network or whatever. But what estimate have you made in the past? Well, the real cost is on the cameras, okay? Yes. It's the number of cameras. So one of the reasons around flipping the model round to say, you tell me your data, and if you did give me the wrong data and I get a photograph of you in a different place, then I'm going to start asking questions. Yes.
It is a way of sort of helping to reduce that cost. But this is going to be in the tens of millions, I think. I don't think it is, back to those huge levels we've seen with some of the other schemes with the levels of camera work. So I think this is certainly affordable. And I think going back to the other point that, again, I think Adam made this point, we should be able to do trials and launch in smaller groups and areas at quite a low cost and learn and make sure we're not going out for one large scheme that's a problem to deliver. I would really encourage that new sort of the minimum viable product route, if you like, to sort of grow this and learn as we do it.
That's really helpful. And in terms of how you would invest in this technology, would that be, I mean, TfL just having to lead on this? Would this be TfL, for example, using the Mayor's green bonds in order to raise the finance for this? Is there a way you recoup the money, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of owning the intellectual property to then you can then sell it around the world if it works and so on? What's your thinking or thinking has gone on that?
Well, as a person involved in that selling of the IP last time, I think this is a difficult space. I think things have moved on, and there's enough companies in the world who are either well developed on this or have products that they could adapt for what we need in London. So I think the real issue here is how can London tap into that, and potentially structure some commercial models that maybe reduces some of the costs for some other return, given our financial situation in London and the politics at the moment. I think that's where the innovation needs to come around, because back to the earlier point, if you are the first player in London to launch this, that gives a commercial entity some advantage as we see this going out, not only in the UK, but around the world.
Oh, it's huge, as you say, and you're right. The world looks at, I think it was discussion earlier, looks at London. I have spoken to many cities, including Stockholm, when they've come to talk to us about the congestion charge and to understand that before they implemented theirs. But just check the green bonds issue. Do you think that's a potential that the Mayor's office is developing and the GLA is developing to help fund this, raise finance for it?
Absolutely. I mean, and again, any form of financing will be needed. And I think the point that I know Nick's not there now, it's the financing of all the supporting measures and other aspects. So, in some respects, this could become a larger problem as we sit there to make sure that you get something for your money, putting it simply. So, yes, I think that would be an ideal route.
Really helpful. Adam, you wanted to come in quickly.
I was going to say, if Matthew's estimate is in the tens of millions, the congestion charge brings in about 400 million a year at the moment, doesn't it? So, in terms of orders of magnitude, I think it's the point he was making at the end, that the scheme itself is not the cost. It's all the stuff you'd want to do alongside it to make it more palatable.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Excellent. I'm going to ask a supplementary of my own, very much not with my chair hat on for one moment. Matthew, you mentioned the potential to trial the technology reasonably soon on a smaller area or a smaller group of users. This is something I suggested last year. This is why I'm saying it, the way I said it. Potentially doing something like that with the Blackwall Tunnel in advance of the expected need in a couple of years to toll both Blackwall and the Silvertown Tunnel, and potentially use those users crossing the tunnel as a cohort of people who might test broader technologies for how much they might pay to drive around more widely without charging them. Does that sound like the sort of thing that the Mayor could be getting on with? Because the time to start introducing and trialling that technology at those crossings is quite soon, actually.
I think you're right in that MVPs and trials can take many forms. The only trouble is your crossings one is if it's for everyone who uses the crossing, then you have to cover all angles and make sure everything is covered. If you end up with a subgroup to say, would some people like to take part in this particular trial? So it becomes, again, I'm doing work in California at the moment where we're getting groups of people to come on board. You have the relationship with them, you can interview them, you can have discussions with them, you can change things around. And their mindset is also, yes, we'll help develop this. Coming back to another point that people have made, how do you get people involved? So I think getting people to co-opt and trial, so you'd have to sort of give them a refund on other taxes, whatever you want to do, but that would be a really useful way, I say, particularly given mobile technology, your setup costs could be pretty much, nothing to get something set up. With a limited group of people, you've just got to design the actual trial itself to be something that could inform and answer questions that you need to be answered.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that was the idea. It was incentivise people crossing and having to pay anyway to join in this smarter trial by offering them something. Excellent. All right, thank you very much. I need to pass over to Assemblymember Desai now.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. So my question to all of you is this. What concerns and issues are being raised by Londoners and indeed the public nationally about potential schemes like this? I'm asking this question in the context of this particular section on technologies and costs. There will be a question later on by a colleague about privacy issues. And I know we already touched upon some of these issues. I think, Silvana, you mentioned a focus group. I didn't quite get everything you said. But if I could just ask for a brief answer, bearing in mind the time, maybe starting off with you, Carolyn.
Concerns that people have voiced around costs and technology.
Yeah.
I think it just comes back to what we've been talking about, that people want to see, a fair scheme, and what's already been mentioned about the use of discounts or allowances, as in the pay-as-you-drive report from the Campaign for Better Transport. But I just wanted to add a thought about the cost, not just the financial cost, but we've got a report called Delayed Responses where we gather data used from the COVID-19 lockdowns to show the cost in terms of delays to emergency vehicles. And we found out that it was the biggest factor in terms of causing delays to the emergency services. And there was a drop of 2 minutes and 33 seconds for serious emergencies for ambulances, and 40 seconds. So these were the drops that we saw when there was less traffic on the roads. So I think those are really important factors to take into account, and it would be good to gather data after it's implemented to see what the impact is on emergency vehicle responses after the scheme's implemented.
Adam, very briefly, please.
I think people are going to ask two fundamental questions. What am I getting for my money? And am I comfortable with how?
Yeah. Sorry, who should I turn to next to this? I think, Silviya, you talked about focus group, but any sort of anything specific coming out?
Yes, so in the survey, we asked at the stage of asking people initially whether they support or oppose the potential to introduce a smart road pricing. And then we asked the reasons for why they have that initial view. The main concern that people expressed at that point was that it would be unfair on people who have no alternative but to drive. So addressing the availability of alternatives, I think it's a primary consideration in this. The second concern was the impact on people that would drive high volumes, like taxi or delivery drivers. So having a cap or other sort of mitigation or a discount for people whose livelihoods depend on this is another thing. But the third consideration was the lack of trust in government or central or local government to introduce a fair system. So I think it's important, the way to address that, I believe, is that co-design early in the system, having a clear explanation of what you're trying to achieve with the system and how you will then address people's concerns at different stages. So bringing people along with you for the journey, I think, is the important concern here.
Thank you. If I can, Sarah, and then finish off with you, Matthew. Sarah?
Just to sort of follow on from Silviya, absolutely, it's got to be a journey that you bring people, residents and businesses along in the process, absolutely vital to ensure they feel very involved in the process going forward and they feel they have had their voices heard is very important. So I think in terms of mitigation measures that Silviya's mentioning, I think that's very important for the small business community too. I think it's also about, again, the supply of vehicles at the moment. Small businesses want to do the right thing. They want to ensure that they can be compliant across the whole Greater London region and that there are really good, useful alternatives if they haven't got the right vehicles at the moment to reduce their costs on a day-by-day basis. So really, I think there's a willing, but they need to feel that they are ready and they've been supported in getting ready.
Matthew?
And I'll just throw in the customer experience, design with the customer at heart, which we're getting a lot better at to make sure that it's easy to pay, easy to use, easy to understand, and easy to question.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Madam.
Thanks so much. I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member Bailey. We're running towards the end of the meeting now, so because you're online and I can't do hand gestures that you can see, I'm just going to ask you to hand back to me with 4 minutes to go. Thank you very much.
I will do. Chair, I can't see if Jillian is still in the room. But just so I know who to address my first question to.
I'm afraid Jillian couldn't attend today. That was one of the guests.
Thank you. Well, maybe I'll start with Silviya and move on to maybe Matthew might be able to make a contribution as well, and any others who feel they have something to add. In practical terms, how could a London-based road user charging network run alongside a national scheme? For instance, would Londoners be expected to pay in London and then still buy whatever road user miles they had to do outside of London? Again, I go back to my thing of would we have to bear all the costs? We talked about the intellectual property being sold, etc. But the marketplace feels very different now than when we sold the Oyster card thing. So what are you hearing from the people that you've been interviewing around what they worry about as a two-tier scheme almost?
So I'll just go back to the previous thing I said about being clear about the differences between a national scheme for taxation and local scheme for congestion pollution. It depends on what is introduced at what stage and what scheme is selected. So, for example, if London was to go ahead of a national scheme with for congestion and pollution purposes, when a national scheme is introduced, it will depend on whether it is integrating all local schemes around the country into it, or whether it is not. As long as people are clear that a national system is for taxation and it replaces fuel duty, whereas a local London system is different and complementary, then I feel that you won't have that double charging concern as much, because you're clear that a national system is replacing fuel duty, a London system is replacing congestion and ULEZ charges, and both are fair in their own right. But when asked about sort of if you had two systems together, there's a clear preference among the public to just have one system that serves those two purposes, as opposed to different schemes. But obviously then you have the consideration about revenue allocation and having robust systems for revenue allocation to the local level as well as the national level, because people were also clear that they want to see that investment in their local area. They want to see a return for what they're paying for congestion, pollution, and investment in those alternatives, in addition to obviously the national scheme funding public services in general.
Okay, thank you. Is anybody? Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was very lucky to hear a discussion hosted by the London Transport Museum on this several years ago, where one view was that Treasury said we should launch a national scheme and then you can add on local congestion charging on top to make it all seamless. I think the other half of the room said this is about pure politics and power play. The sooner London gets its scheme in place, the more chance it has in its hand of negotiation with central government over how this will pan out. So everything is possible, you know, as this evolves. I would think that the politics would dictate if London can go early and go first and get it established. That's a far better position for London to be to deal with this question, which is going to appear either way. I think it's a very good question, and in some respects, it's a difficult question, and it's how to get London in its best position to deal with that when it comes up.
Thank you. I've just been texted a question by a friend of mine who's watching this, and it's a very simple question. How many people on the panel are opposed to road user charging? Again, and he texts that to me. He's talking about bringing the public along. He's saying we're having a conversation as if this is inevitable and we have no voices in the room to add some balance. And I think, Chair, that's something we might want to consider.
Chair, Sean, we carefully scoped the meeting, so we weren't going to consider whether or not and just look at how for politically sensitive reasons. And I think you were there for that discussion.
I have a Londoner texting me, and that's his take on it, that we're all leaning one way, because he knows I'm very open-minded to this. I think it's a good idea, and he says we're all leaning one way. But let me go to my final question.
If the panel wants to express their opinion on that, they can, but they're not obliged to.
I mean, I think we have forms of road charging already. You know, this is we're looking at an evolution of existing schemes. I am not, you know, at this stage for or against any particular scheme. I think that we have a messy system at the moment. We have a system that is going to run out of road because of the changes in technology. And we have a city that is a lot of the time gridlocked and polluted. And I think that if you put all those things together, we can probably come up with something better. But the idea that we're not doing this, and the same with the local versus national scheme, I think it's very revealing that when we start talking about these complexities, we all default to talking about congestion-focused schemes for London, and I think that's probably where we all sort of instinctively land there. But we do this. We have fuel duty, we have VED, we have the congestion charge, we have the ULEZ. We can deal with this complexity. We can have a TfL fare system for public transport in London and a national rail fare system, and we can make them, not always perfectly, but we can make them mostly speak to each other, and people can understand it. You know, this is building on the world as it is, and I think we need to be careful about presenting it in that way, and not suggesting this is, you know, some brand new panacea that's going to come out of nowhere and solve everything, because that's just not the reality.
Sarah?
Yes, no, just to add there, so FSB, as you're aware, did a survey on the ultra low emission zone back in the summer, and so in terms of the findings, we found that 30% did agree to an emission-based road charging system as opposed to the current LEZ, ULEZ and congestion zones. We've got that. And just in terms of that sort of London versus national, there are a few sort of just open questions or open comments made by businesses that completed the survey that did say, why are we not looking at there being a nationwide one and London fitting into that? But that wasn't a majority view. That was just sort of open comments made when there's a chance for businesses to make extra comments. So we have got some that said that too.
Thank you. Matthew?
My only comment was Tony Travers commented that rationing was the last thing we used when we had a real emergency, and maybe that's something else that should be thrown into the mix as well as charging. So I made no claim for that, but it answers your question that maybe there are other views out there and other solutions that we should be looking at.
Thank you for that. That's a great interjection there. Chair, I'm just going to move on to my last question now. How important are privacy concerns, both in legal
Assembly Member Bailey, I'm really sorry. It is now 4 minutes to go to the end of the meeting, and we have a hard stop from the building has texted us to say they need the route back. So is it possible that we could write to our guests with the final questions? They do focus on privacy, both in terms of opinions and technology. And I think to get to the bottom of those as we wish to, we're not going to manage that in the 1 minute we have left.
Chair, I'm happy for written responses. I think they'll probably contain more detail as well.
And I think, given you were set to ask these questions, we will consult you about the wording of the questions to the guests, if that's all right with you.
Please do, Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm sorry to curtail things. It was far too interesting. Carolyn, is that something you could contribute to us in writing?
Well, I just wanted to make a very quick point in response to Sean's previous question.
Go on, the previous question.
Okay. Yeah, so just to note that research does show that charging is the most effective strategy for reducing car traffic. This is from research that's come out this year, leading to a reduction in city centre cars of between 12 and 33%. We know that we need to reduce traffic by at least 27%, as announced by the Mayor in January, by 2030. And ultimately, I think, you've got to think about the future constituents as well as the current ones. And the point about do we have anyone on the panel opposed to road user charging? The evidence shows that this is what is required. So at the end of the day, I think, like I say, we've just got to act in the public interest. Those goals are already stated, within the Mayor's transport strategy.
Yeah, but those goals are stated by the Mayor. Not everybody would agree. And of course, there's a big difference between parts of London. And I think the person who texted me the question wants to decide which way they want to go. So they wanted a broader conversation, which meant people who were opposed to it in their mind. That's what.
Thank you very much, Silviya. But there's plenty of time to have that broader conversation. I think one of the things we recommended as a committee this summer was there needs to be a big conversation with Londoners ahead of anything like this coming in. Thank you for your contributions, though. I'd like to thank all of our guests, including Nick, who has left, for attending this morning, for their incredibly interesting answers to the questions. And we will be writing to each of you with some follow-up for written and more detail on some of the things you've mentioned. Our next steps as a committee will be a further meeting on this topic in February, where we hope to be able to put some of the points raised to decision makers and hopefully TfL, maybe government. We'll see who will come. The committee now has a few more items of business to deal with, but in the meantime, guests feel free to leave the chamber. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group leave members to agree any output arising from the meeting? I think we outlined what that is already. Can we note the work programme and meeting dates?
Noted.
And I can tell you the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 17th of January 2023 at 10 o'clock here in the chamber, where we won't be discussing road charging that time. That will be in February, and there's no urgent business, and the meeting can now be declared closed. Thank you.
Well done.